The Palaiologi were the last imperial Roman dynasty, and the longest-lasting one. Therefore, their importance in Roman history is undeniable, even if they were far from the ideal rulers that the Roman Empire required in those last trying days of the late Middle Ages. There doesn't seem to be any resource online that covers this dynasty from beginning to end, and considering that I spent a good year of my life studying their history and era, well, I will present to you the whole story from the founding of this family to the end of their grasp on Romania when the Despotate of the Morea fell in 1460. Today, July 25th, is the day when in 1261, the general of Michael Palaiologos, Alexios Larigopoulos, recaptured Constantinople from the Latin occupiers, the event which finally gave the Palaiologi the legitimacy they needed to do the final usurpation from the ruling Nicaean dynasty of the Laskarids. So, I thought it was fitting to upload this video today. It's a compilation of the 4-part epic series on Palaiologan history that I did for Eastern Rome Summarized, parts of the epilogue on the fall of the Morea, and the aftermath for Thomas and Demetrios Palaiologos. And, as new content, I will briefly talk about the origins of this dynasty right now. Where did the Palaiologi come from? To be frank, we don't know. Like many dynasties of Middle Byzantium, Palaiologi attributed their own origins to Roman Italy, claiming to be descendants of some old senatorial house that Constantine the Great invited to move to New Rome, Constantinople, when it was first built. This origin story was very common among Eastern Roman aristocrats, and you can find versions of it everywhere, among the Ducai, for example. For a dynasty that had so much contact with the Latins and whose politics depended quite a bit on Italy and the papacy, this myth became pretty central to the agenda of Palaiologan emperors like Michael VIII, who emphasized his roots from Viterbo, a city to the northwest of Rome, and used it to explain the etymology of the word Palaiologos. Viterbo comes from the Latin words vetus verbium, which means old word, and that, translated to Greek, is Palaiologos. Of course, this is quite fanciful, and modern scholars, such as Jean-Claude Chenet, would rather attribute their provenance to Anatolia. In any case, the Palaiologi were later comers to the great military families of Anatolia. Their first truly notable member came with the rise of the Comneni and a new Roman Empire under the Comnenian system. He was Georgios Palaiologos, a close kin of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, and we know quite a bit about him because he was something of a favorite uncle for the historian Princess Anna Komneni, who also introduced quite a few other Palaiologi into history. Georgios was one of Alexios' most trusted generals in the troubled early days of his reign. He fought along the Comneni against the Normans and Pachymeres, distinguishing himself by retaking Kastoria from the Normans and his important role in the great Roman victory over the Pachymeres at the Battle of Lavunion. He served the Comnenian dynasty loyally until his death, earning for his descendants a high place among the new aristocratic system of the Comneni, and through his son, Nikephoros. He was an ancestor of Andronikos Palaiologos, the Megas Domesticos appointed by the Laskarid imperial dynasty, while the Romans were in exile after 1204. When Emperor Ioannis III Doukas Vatatzis reconquered Thessaloniki in Macedonia, he made Andronikos and his son, Michael Palaiologos, the governors there. And, well, Michael's story I have already narrated to you. The charming young Palaiologos clawed his way up the Nicaean ranks, being accused of conspiracy several times by Vatatzis and his son, Emperor Theodoros II Laskaris, who hated him with a passion. But in the end, Michael triumphed, assumed regency of Theodoros II's son, Ioannis IV, through a bloody coup d'etat, and ruled Nicaea de facto and warred against the Latins until that fateful day in July 25th, 1261. Thus began the story of the Palaiologan imperial dynasty. In Oration, 1261, the Roman common folk murmured about how Constantinople was reconquered. A servant of Irene Palaiologina informed his mistress, who was so delighted that she ran at top speed to tell her slumbering brother Michael. "Rise, Emperor, for Christ has conferred Constantinople upon you," she said. Thus did Michael Palaiologos, the regent of the young Emperor of Nicaea, learn about his men's accidental reconquest of the Queen of Cities. Soon, he would replace the Laskarid dynasty with his own Palaiologan one, the last imperial Roman dynasty. Welcome back to Eastern Rome Summarized. For Michael's triumph in Constantinople to celebrate this victory, see the previous video I made with no-budget films. Now let's jump straight to the point. Michael VIII Palaiologos, now formally emperor and in possession of the Queen of Cities, wasted no time revamping the Latin-ravished capital with new building projects, reforming administration, and his greatest contribution to the empire, a navy. Rome's own navy declined steadily from the Comnenian era into almost non-existence by the time of 1204, due to reliance on Italian ships. But Palaiologos reconstituted a proper Roman naval force with warlike Peloponnesian natives, the Taconians, and the new mixed Romano-Latin population of Constantinople, the Gasmuli. But, as you will see, Palaiologos was a mixed bag, huger than his ego, so he also messed up seriously. Notably, he blinded Ioannis IV and deposed him, the first of his actions which divided the Roman population at the worst time possible. Not only were Anatolian Romans fiercely attached to their Laskarid lords, but so was Patriarch Arsenios, who was elevated by Ioannis' father. He went off the rails when he heard of the blinding and antagonized Michael, excommunicating him for life. This sowed the seeds of the Arsenite schism later on, as the Patriarch would never forgive Palaiologos, who had another plateful of problems to deal with at the same time. Michael II of Epirus first attacked, but Ioannis Palaiologos, the emperor's brother and veteran who already bodied the Epirots once, did it again and forced peace on the Western Roman state. He then proceeds to subjugate the Serbs and Albanians, who were Epirus' allies. The emperor's other brother, Konstantinos, took the army south and attacked Morea and Monemvasia. To follow up on this momentum, Palaiologos appointed his first megasdukes, Alexios Philanthropinos, who took the new navy for a spin, sacked many Latin Aegean islands, then supported Konstantinos in Monemvasia. The Prince of Achaia, who was captured by Ioannis, was ransomed back to the Franks for these parts, returning Roman rule to the Peloponnese. This quiet province is about to become crucial in late Byzantine history. For this attack, the Pope annulled his oath to the Romans and threatened a crusade with the exiled Latin Emperor Baldwin. To counter this, Michael proposed his most controversial idea: union with the Catholic Church. For he believed, and he was right, that the West was miles more dangerous than any internal dissension or Eastern enemies should they re-crusade. His sole focus on the West helped the empire stave off the existential threat, but left too many loose ends. For example, his friend, Sultan Kydones II of Rome, came to seek help after being deposed. Michael could have taken advantage of it to make some gains in the increasingly unstable East, but he detained the Sultan, who once saved him when he was in the same situation, all because he wanted to ally with the Ilkhanids who caused this. Kydones was able to escape with the Golden Horde's help, and boy was he mad with Michael. Khan Nogai decided to capitalize on that. Soon, the Mongols saw another potential ally, Bulgaria. Tsar Constantine Tikh's wife was Laskari's sister, and in 1263 she urged the Bulgarians to raid into Rome to avenge her brother. But he was defeated by Michael Glavas Darchaniotis, who also captured cities up to Anchialos for Rome. Tikh desperately turned to his overlord Nogai for help. Meanwhile, Genoa lost in one of its squabbles with Venice, so Michael granted the privileges he gave Genoa to Venice instead. In Trebizond, Manuel Megas Komnenos died after ruling 25 years. That was the high point of Trapezuntine power. We may even conjecture, despite lack of sources, that Manuel expanded his empire southeast thanks to his Ilkhanid allies, taking the rich silver mines of the Bayburt region. But after the death of this great emperor, who ignored Palaiologos' demands to relinquish his title, things fell apart. Manuel's son Andronikos II succeeded, ruling for 3 brief years during which he lost Sinope to Mu'in ad-Din Suleiman Kydones' rival from Rome, that the Ilkhanids started to favor at the expense of Trebizond. Mongols were fickle, and the Romans knew that, but they still had to play the game in this new Mongol world. Sultan Baybars, Mamluk ruler of Egypt, corresponded with the Golden Horde via Constantinople, so it was just as impossible for Palaiologos to not get involved as Trebizond. The Ilkhanids weren't happy with this, but Baybars was happy about the cooperation, giving Palaiologos much influence in the Orthodox churches of his domains. However, the Golden Horde wasn't as grateful as the Egyptian, and Nogai proceeded with his plan to attack Romania. In winter 1264, the Mongols crossed the frozen Danube and ravaged Thrace with Bulgarians and Caicos. They came so suddenly and with such force that Palaiologos himself was almost captured and barely escaped. What was he doing in Thrace at that time? He was dealing with Epirus and the Principality of Achaia, both of whom were breaking their treaties with Constantinople, the former with small skirmishes and the latter with full-on war. Constantinos was sent south again, and he succeeded in taking Laconia back in 1263, but he suffered a few defeats and his Turkish mercenaries defected to the Franks, so he went home, leaving his men to deal with the Achaeans alone. This resulted in the defeat at Makriplagi. William was able to hold the Roman reconquest of the whole Peloponnese. When Michael got home in 1265, Arsenios welcomed him with a harsh "I told you so" speech about the battles with Epirus, and urged him to make permanent peace. Michael II's eldest son, Nikephoros, a widow, married Palaiologos' niece, Anna. Another marriage arranged for Constantinople was that of Palaiologos' illegitimate daughter Mary of the Mongols to the Ilkhan. Palaiologos confirmed Nikephoros' title of despot. He was happy with his wife, becoming a Palaiologan ally. So Epirus lived happily ever after in coexistence with Constantinople. No, wait, wrong script. See, Michael II had more sons, and as was Epirot tradition, his bastard, Ioannis Doukas, would make opposing Constantinople his life mission. But now we must address a critical issue of Palaiologos' reign, Anatolia. Michael was known to have neglected his eastern subjects and their defense. The Mongol invasions weakened Rome, but caused mass migration of Turkic warriors into Asia Minor, and these bays saw fertile Roman land for the grabbing. The Laskaris had reformed the Akritai, who defended the Roman border for centuries against the Arabs, but Palaiologos cut their pay to fund his projects in the west and to weaken them, for he feared revolt from these Laskari loyalists. So city after city began falling to the Turkish refugees. The Anatolian Romans had to suffer neglect and distrust from their own emperor while facing constant threat from invaders. It's no wonder some started turning themselves over to the Turks, while others turned their frustration towards Palaiologos, who, to be fair, did realize the problem and sent his best man Ioannis to secure southern Anatolia for the empire, but did not do nearly enough. When Michael got rid of Arsenios and installed his own patriarch at last, this caused the Arsenate schism. Arsenios didn't lift his excommunication of Michael, so when a new patriarch did, that sparked fierce controversy. Arsenites were made up mostly of these Anatolians, and they caused countless troubles for the administration. And this was even before Michael finalized his union with Old Rome, which would cause his subjects to hate him even more. During these years, however, with the advent of such an unthinkable insult against orthodoxy, many Romans sought refuge with Michael's rivals in Epirus and Trebizond, asking them to champion the Roman faith. This was what Georgios Megas Komnenos, Andronikos II's brother, found waiting for him in 1266 when he ascended to the Trapezuntine throne, along with alliance requests from a powerful newcomer to international politics. These letters to Trebizond were sent by Charles d'Anjou, brother of Louis IX of France, new king of Sicily after having defeated its previous one, Manfred. Charles was the definition of ambition. Like countless European monarchs before him, he dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire by subjugating the Eastern Roman Empire, and his eyes were on Constantinople. The crusade Michael feared so much seemed like it was happening, so he hastened his union plan. Only the Pope could save Rome from another Western conquest now, ironically. But before that could happen, the Pope encouraged Charles to launch another crusade against Constantinople with ex-Emperor Baldwin and the Achaean Franks. So, in 1267, these new allies signed the Treaty of Viterbo, and it seemed as if soon the whole might of the West might fall upon Romania. Palaiologos started scrambling for allies too. He returned favor to the Genoese by giving them their own quarter in Galata, and lured the Venetians too. Maybe the news of Michael II's death might have made Palaiologos happy, but the despot's ambitious bastard, Ioannis Doukas, got Thessaly, closer to the city than Epirus, which went to Nikephoros, whom Palaiologos subdued with marriage alliance. He tried the same with Doukas, but his fickle nephew who married Doukas' daughter will betray him later. All the while, Michael appointed a new patriarch, Joseph, to lift this excommunication on sketchy legal basis, so that besides submission to Rome, the Arsenites had another excuse to stir things up. In 1268, Joseph tried to play nice with the Arsenites but failed to calm them, so Michael resorted to good old steel, which also didn't suppress them. Then Pope Clement IV died, so Michael temporarily halted union negotiations and turned to Louis IX to delay Charles. Ioannis Palaiologos retook the Strymon Valley from Thessaly, but his work in Anatolia was undone. In 1269, Caria was gradually permanently taken by Turks of Menteşe, the first beylik formed after Rome's decline. A beylik like it would soon become the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, Louis managed to drag Charles with him on the Eighth Crusade in 1270, but he died in Tunis and Charles' fleet was wrecked by a storm. Palaiologos was ecstatic, as he delayed the Angevin enough for pro-Union Pope Gregory X to be elected in 1271, who forbade Charles from military acts against the Romans, though not quick enough to stop him from taking Dyrrhachion with Albanian help. Thus, Michael intensified Union propaganda and anti-Union bashing, while Doukas and other Balkan states began offering alliance to the invader. In 1272, Michael crowned his son Andronikos II emperor, while the nephew he married off to Thessaly defected to Doukas, who started acting up again and threw in with Latin powers around him. Charles was extremely powerful by 1273, eager as ever to destroy Romania, leashed back only by the Pope, who saw that Palaiologos was really forcing union hard by then. The Hartophylax Ioannis Veikos first opposed the Vasilevs, but in prison he changed his mind and became the most pro-union ally of Michael, so he started spreading unionist propaganda too. Along with severe persecution and dumbing down the terms of union, Michael finally convinced the church to accept it on very flimsy terms, and a Roman delegation was sent to Lyon to officialize the union. Some good news did come from the Roman military. An ambitious Latin from Evia, called Licario, was taken into the Roman navy and he unleashed hell on his Latin compatriots in the Aegean, beginning by conquering several major forts on Evia for Palaiologos. Then, in 1274, he fought successfully against Turks in Anatolia too. Michael sent his brother Ioannis to Thessaly against the rebellious Doukas. Ioannis effortlessly smashed Doukas' army and laid siege to his capital Neopatros, but Doukas was a crafty fellow and snuck out of his city to call on his Latin pals in Athens, who then jumped on the Romans and dealt Ioannis his only ever defeat. Other Latins in Evia and Crete leaped at this opportunity and attacked the Roman fleet at Demetrios port, slaughtering many Roman marines until, coincidentally, the retreating Ioannis heard of the attack and rushed to save his soldiers. The arrival of their general and of Admiral Alexios Doukas Philanthropinos did wonders for Roman morale, and the tides were reversed. The Latins fell like sheep and their leaders were captured. This battle did insane damage to the Aegean Latins, which Licario was able to capitalize on later. But his patron Philanthropinos died of a wound from the fight, and Ioannis Palaiologos resigned from the army despite this brilliant victory, as he was deeply ashamed of what happened at Neopatros. But really, that wasn't his fault. Michael lost two of his best generals, but he got Licario, trusting him to retake the Aegean for the empire, which he now set out to do. Meanwhile, the Romans made it to the Council of Lyon, where Michael's historian, Georgios Acropolitis, presented documents of submission to Old Rome and reunion was achieved. This allowed Michael to attack Angevin footholds in Albania and Epirus, reducing the western threat, but you can imagine how appalled Romans were. In Bulgaria, Tiek's wife, Michael's niece Maria, took over and tried to incite enemies of the empire to attack. Her court became a hotbed for anti-unionists, like Epirus and Trebizond. In 1275, Patriarch Joseph had enough and abdicated, so Veikos replaced him, though he could do little to curb the intense rage of his populace. Arsenites gained much support, and Asian Romans suffered Michael's brutal crackdown, so they were either displaced or mass defected to the Turks. This was really when the Asian frontier of the empire went down a full decline. To defend Anatolia, Michael continued his policy of using talented Latins. He gave Phocaea to the Genoese Zaccaria brothers as a fee for guarding Smyrna. In the same vein, Licario was making great progress in conquering Evia, so Michael gave that island to him as a fief too in 1276. But Gregory X died, meaning all that work put into union was again wasted. The Romans were on the brink of civil war for nothing, and Charles was free to attack the Romans again. This time, even Nicephorus started negotiating with him, and Genoese pirates just decided to show up at the worst time. In Neopatros, Epirus hosted an anti-unionist synod in 1277, excommunicating Palaiologos, who let Veccus excommunicate them too in a council of his own while he kept persecuting Arsenites and the Josephites, who were angry at Joseph's resignation. Yes, things kept getting worse, but not only for the Romans. Maria's Bulgarian government was doing horribly. Soon, Ivailo, a swineherd who later Marxists would claim as the first of their own, led a social revolution against the monarchy, devastating Bulgaria. Michael capitalized on it, backing his son-in-law Ivanasin III against Ivailo, who took over Bulgaria in 1278 and clashed many times with the Roman forces under Glavas and their Mongol allies. While in Asia, Andronikos II and his cousin Michael Tarkaniotis saved Tralles from Turkish conquest. Yes, Andronikos II actually proved useful for once, surprisingly. Asia Minor received another ray of hope after the failed uprising of the Cretan Greek Otatsis brothers. Michael had been encouraging sedition on Venetian Crete for years, and he offered refuge to the followers of the Otatsis in Anatolia after the Venetians defeated them. The warlike Cretans would be the cream of a brief Anatolian restoration in Andronikos II's reign. Back in Bulgaria, Glavas took Tarnovo in 1279 and placed Ivanasin III on the throne. But Michael's triumph proved short, as Ivailo attacked back with vigor and drove Asin out. Roman armies were annihilated, while Charles d'Anjou's preparation for war went well. He vassalized Epirus, and after the death of yet another pope, he finally began his ultimate offensive in 1280, attacking the Balkans from Albania. Palaiologos quickly handled Ivailo by convincing Nogai to murder him and prepared for his final showdown with Charles. Bulgaria went through absolute hell and was weakened. A power vacuum in the Balkans appeared, filled by the Serbs. They invaded Macedonia, but were repelled by Constantinos Palaiologos Porphyrogenitus, Michael's third son. However, they'll be prominent enemies in coming years. That year, Licario also disappeared from history, after having conquered from Skopelos to Kythera, the Cyclades to Lemnos, and of course Evia too, where he captured his Triarch and the Duke of Athens. But his capital remained in Latin hands, so they retook the island later. In Trebizond, Georgios Megas Komnenos was betrayed by his nobles to the Ilkhan, and his brother Ioannis II Megas Komnenos took the throne. Seeing Ioannis' young age, Michael attempted to convince him to ditch the imperial title in 1281 by proposing a marriage, but the Emperor of Trebizond refused to sell his dignity, so Michael went back to the task at hand. The armies of Charles, led by a giant called Hugh of Sully, are advancing quickly through Albania, and all of Thrace risked falling. Palaiologos quickly assembled an army under Tarkaniotis and Ioannis Synadinos to counter the Latins. Against all odds, the small Roman army not only relieved the besieged cities, but also captured Sully, the Angevin siege machines, and a lot of booty. This was the most impressive Palaiologan victory in 2 decades and ended all threat of Charles on land. Now he had to attack Constantinople by sea, but that required time. So in that time, the overjoyed Romans celebrated a triumph, and Michael got some time to defend the eastern borders for a bit. But by then it was already too late to save Anatolia from the Turks. He could only delay the inevitable. Charles got a French puppet to be his pope, who excommunicated Michael, betraying the union, and he allied with basically the whole Balkans against Romania. Again, the situation seemed hopeless, like Constantinople would again fall. But then, just then, on Easter 1282, Charles was chilling, dreaming of empire. Why not? He was the most powerful monarch of Europe, if not the whole world by then. But wait, sacre bleu! Why are the Sicilians suddenly killing all the French at Palermo? How dare they? Charles sent his entire fleet to put down his revolting subjects, only to find King Peter of Aragon jumping at the chance and taking over Sicily. So much for an Ajman Mediterranean empire. As Charles seethed in the corner, wondering what went wrong, he knew only one evil mastermind was capable of such a feat: Palaiologos. The Roman emperor used his Western connections and Greek gold to help incite the bloody Sicilian Vespers, which finally ended all threats against Constantinople from the west. Besides reconquering Constantinople, safeguarding Constantinople was his greatest achievement. It took him 20 years, but he did it, although in the meantime he could do almost nothing about the smaller problems plaguing the empire, the Turks, the Serbs, and Roman rivals. Michael did succeed in at last convincing Ioannis of Trebizond to drop his title and become a despotis instead, as in Trebizond there were several uprisings and Ioannis was kinda desperate. From then on, Trapezuntine emperors were nominally subject to the restored Palaiologan Empire and went by the title of Emperor of all the East, Peratia, and Iberia, no longer claiming to be the emperors of Rome. This is a good cutoff point for Trapezuntine history, as you may have already read my announcement of saving Trebizond's story for another series. Like, don't you think the video is already getting long enough? Now let's look back at the Balkans. The new Serbian king, Stefan Milutin, was highly energetic and began his reign by taking Skopje from the Romans, making it his capital. Ioannis Doukas of Thessaly again acted up and raided the empire for fun, so Palaiologos immediately had to campaign in the Balkans against these enemies. He called on Nogai for Mongol mercenaries and was about to take the field, but he had long neglected his own health for state affairs, and this caught up to him. On December 11th, Michael VIII Palaiologos passed away, and he was buried without ceremony by his son Andronikos II, who, as the new emperor, also abandoned the union. It was this affair which made Michael, the savior of Romania, hated by his own people. I realize I've talked a lot about Michael VIII, but maybe that's a good thing, as the more I write, the more I realize how he was an era started like Alexios I Komnenos, equal in brilliance but inferior in accomplishments due to the worse circumstances he was in. Like Alexios, Michael had to drastically change the empire and go against his own people on many occasions, but they both saved Rome from immediate destruction. They were both excellent diplomats and played important roles in contemporary world politics. If Michael had a son as capable as Ioannis II, then we may be talking about a Palaiologan restoration today. But unfortunately, Andronikos II was what sprung from his loins, and Andronikos was just... He immediately gave way to the ecclesiastical factions within the empire, the Arsenites and Josephites, trying to please everyone but ending up pleasing none. Patriarch Bekos was forced to resign and claimed he supported union unwillingly, as did many of the Palaiologi. Andronikos then chose a new patriarch, Georgios of Cyprus, but the Arsenites didn't like him and still weren't happy. Repudiating union and being bossed by the clergy was not the worst thing Andronikos could have done to his father's legacy. He also disbanded the Roman fleet. So, say goodbye to the vigorous native marine corps who struck terror into Latin hearts and re-established Roman hegemony over the Aegean and the Peloponnese. Andronikos returned to hiring Latins for the empire's naval protection. Their last action was in Thessaly, 1284, where Michael planned to attack just before dying. After the Vespers, Nikephoros of Epirus became docile to Constantinople again, drifting apart from his brother. His wife, Anna, plotted with Andronikos to weaken Thessaly. The couple kidnapped Doukas' heir and trafficked him to prison in Constantinople. Then Tarchaniotis led the army and Synadinos led the fleet to besiege Demetrius. The port was not taken only due to a plague outbreak, killing Tarchaniotis. Doukas was furious, and Thessaly fought Epirus until an uneasy peace was reached. And oh yeah, remember Tralles, saved by Andronikos a while back? That city fell permanently to the Turks after a brutal siege. Then, after Shah d'Anjou died in 1285, Andronikos disbanded the fleet. He was tight on cash and cared deeply for Anatolia, whose defense needed no fleet, but a well-equipped army. Yet this terrible decision not only didn't save Asia Minor, but strengthened both Latins and Turks in the Aegean, as the unemployed Roman marines needed work. Any work. So this explains the naval paralysis of the empire you'll see later on. Losing a brilliant general, an Anatolian city he invested heavily in, and a fleet at the outset of his reign. Great job, Andronikos. What an optimistic start. Back to the church. The new patriarch, Georgios, was busy excommunicating people. Andronikos hosted a synod last year for Arsenites in hopes of winning them back, but they didn't care, so they were excommunicated. Bekos came out of exile to protest his replacement, so Georgios gave him a synod in 1285 where he was convicted of heresy again and excommunicated. Georgios re-emphasized orthodoxy too, even though the unity Andronikos hoped would come from this never did. Many unionist officials were exiled, including a certain Georgios Metochitis, whose son would use those exile years well and make such an impression on Andronikos years later that he'd become his most famous courtier. We'll introduce him later. Now we have a bit of a gap on events in Andronikos II's reign, so I'll update you a bit on events in Latin-occupied Roman lands in the area. In Crete, the Venetians were getting hammered by the revolt of Alexios Kalergis, who claimed descent from Nikephoros Phokas, while in the Levant, the Mamluks were finalizing their conquest of Crusader Syria. So down south, the Latins weren't doing well, but without a Roman fleet in the north, some Latins gradually retook their Aegean possessions. In 1289, the son of Shah d'Anjou, Shah II, was released from prison and replanned the crusade of his father, so an Angevin threat was revived, but luckily for Andronikos, they were deprived of Thessaly as an ally, as Doukas died that year. The Vasilevs also forced Patriarch Gregorios to resign for the unity of the church, as the Arsenites and Josephites won't stop complaining. But his replacement, Athanasius I, didn't please everyone either, as he was a real ascetic and actually took religion seriously instead of using it as a front for private gain. In these tough times, when Asian refugees flooded the streets of Constantinople and the Roman common folk were suffering more and more from poverty, Athanasius took it upon himself to aid his compatriots and denounce greedy clergy. So as amazing as he was as a person, his appointment gave the church more dissension. In 1290, Andronikos began a 3-year stay in Asia Minor, fortifying the region and trying to raise local support. Surprisingly, he visited the monk Ioannis IV Laskaris, who was blinded by his father. Meanwhile in Greece, the new prince of Achaea, Phlogon, asked for peace with the Romans, as he knew the end of Frankish Achaea was near. But the next year he still helped Shah II negotiate an alliance with Epirus. The Latins were desperate. That year, Acre fell to the Mamluks, officially ending the Crusader states. All that's left for them in the Eastern Mediterranean were their pickings from the Fourth Crusade, and they clung on as much as they could. Andronikos couldn't do anything about this in Anatolia, so he sent Glavas against Epirus and Thessaly in 1292. The latter was humbled, but Glavas failed to take Ioannina from Epirus. The Romans withdrew from Epirus the next year. In Achaea, they reconquered Kalamata, but Phlogon protested against the violation of their peace treaty, so Andronikos let him have it back. He was busy anyway, slandering his more capable brother Konstantinos the Porphyrogenitos, who was exiled. But he also did some good, as he attempted to rebuild the Akritae, which his father disbanded. With the Cretan refugees, his father resettled. Andronikos did this with the most gifted general of his era, Alexios Philanthropinos, who was given ultimate command over all of Roman Asia, launching the most successful reconquest of the region by far. After this, the Vasilevs returned to Constantinople, where the church demanded his attention again. As expected, Athanasius ruffled the wrong feathers, so he had to resign. Andronikos appointed a certain Cosmas as the new patriarch, who officially crowned his son and heir, Michael IX Palaiologos, as emperor in 1294. The affair with Athanasius may be caused by Nikephoros Humnos, a rapidly rising courtier who became Mesoson that year. Humnos was very intelligent, but had free reign over the government now that Andronikos was doing his job less, so he was often accused of corruption too. Also, when Andronikos returned from Asia, he came back with Theodoros Metochitis, son of the exiled Georgios, who impressed the Vasilevs with his erudition. Metochitis would succeed Humnos and be infinitely more well-learned and corrupt than he ever was. The rise of ultra-big-brain courtiers, caught knee-deep in controversies, was a Palaiologan phenomenon that you should be aware of. The intellectuals of the era shone probably the brightest in all of Roman history, with their obsession with science and classics, and I would be happy to mention their achievements when the true flowering took place later, but the focus of this video is on the situation of the early Palaiologan state, so we must pass on this topic for now. Back to history. Philanthropinos' efforts in Anatolia bore fruit. He cut through the Beylik of Menteşe like butter and recaptured cities up to Miletus. Turkish POWs filled the markets of Anatolia, and Turks cowered at the mere mention of Philanthropinos, who secured Lydia and was taking his advance further south. In the west, Shah II agreed to marry his heir to Nikephoros' daughter, and Epirus had to cede some forts as dowry, but Thessaly jumped at the chance and seized the forts in 1295. Meanwhile, Philanthropinos had liberated Miletus and almost all of the former Thema of Melanudion. He was at the height of his fame. The Anatolian Romans loved him, and later historians would call him a Belisarius of the Palaiologan era. which was ironic. He too was soon asked to rebel against the Vasilevs. Philanthropinos was hesitant, but then agreed. So, an Andronikos loyalist bribed the Cretans to blind the victorious general by Christmas. The new Belisarius was exiled, disappearing for decades before a highly desperate Andronikos required his military talent again by the end of his reign. The Turks breathed a sigh of relief. Back in Constantinople, a great earthquake in 1296 tumbled Michael VIII's self-built statue, and the Romans interpreted it as a sign of disasters to come. This one came from the Italians. Venice and Genoa were squabbling over something stupid, but used Constantinople as their battleground. The Venetians attacked the Genoese quarters there, but also caused heavy collateral to Roman possessions. Andronikos was powerless against this blatant trespassing of his own capital, and had no one but himself to blame, because he let go of the Roman fleet. Then when the Genoese massacred Venetians in Constantinople, Andronikos stuck by his allies and incurred the wrath of the Venetians, who assaulted the Bosporus and declared war on Romania. But real fighting would only occur later. The age of Italian maritime states bullying Romans had begun. More bad news came from Evia, as the Latins fully retook the island now. The Serbs too took Dyrrachium, so in 1297, Glavas was made commander of the Roman West and sent to counter them. But this experienced general couldn't deal with the guerrilla tactics of the Serbs, so he cut his losses and convinced Andronikos to settle for peace. The Vasilevs tried convincing his sister Evdokia, the Empress of Trebizond, to marry Milutin, but she refused. So, he decided to marry his own 5-year-old daughter, Simonis, to the 50-year-old king, who was expecting his 5th marriage by 1298. Medohitis was sent to Serbia to negotiate this messed-up treaty, while Andronikos looked for someone to defend Asia Minor again. He sent his cousin, Ioannis Tarchaniotis, a highly capable soldier and administrator, to the Meander front. But despite his successes in pushing back the Turks and managing the land, the jealous local elites used Tarchaniotis' past as an arsonite to denounce him for treason. So, Roman progress in Anatolia was once more halted due to Palaiologan politics. And what a horrible time for that too, as the next year, in the environs of Bithynia, a Turkish bey became a sultan. Unlike the other beyliks forming from the corpse of Rome, this one would dominate not only some Anatolian locality, but all of the past territories of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Romans knew him as Atman, but we call him Osman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire. With his energetic band of Ghazis and Roman renegades, Andronikos' remaining possessions in Anatolia would fall to Osman one after one. The final conquest of Rome begun. Andronikos meanwhile was celebrating Simonis' marriage with Milutin, after which their Macedonian border was respected, at a terrible cost. Lecherous Milutin loved his child bride so much that he didn't even wait until Simonis matured to consummate his marriage. And just as Serbia was placated, Venice pursued war with the Romans after making peace with the ungrateful Genoa, who left their Roman allies to their own fate. Things were not looking forward for Andronikos by the turn of 1300, although an influx of Christian ally mercenaries fleeing the Mongols made Andronikos believe he can use them against the Ottomans. He prepared an expedition for them under Michael IX, who departed in 1302 from Magnesia. The Turks avoided direct battle and harassed the Romans out by raids, so Andronikos sent another army to confront the Ottomans at Bathia's plain, between the key cities of Nicaea and Nicomedia, only to be defeated and lose the countryside of Bithynia. This was the first major Ottoman victory. The Turks roamed free and ravaged the region, and Roman refugees fled Asia en masse. Venice opportunistically attacked Constantinople and landed at Principle, where they flogged the refugees on that island in full sight of the citizens of the city for ransom. Hearing of more Turkish victories in Bithynia, Andronikos had to pay the inhumane Venetians whatever they wanted and let them keep some Aegean islands, ending this war. But the situation in Anatolia was pure chaos. Major cities couldn't fall to the Turkish bands yet, but they were isolated and left on their own for defense. The empire was in deep, deep trouble again. In desperation, Andronikos made the mistake of hiring expensive Latin mercenaries to fight the Turks. But that whole can of worms I will leave for the next video, where we will finish the reign of Andronikos II and cover up to the Palaiologan civil wars. Because I've had enough of his incompetence for now. Michael VIII restored the Roman Empire, only for Andronikos II to ruin his achievements and doom the empire's survival. He had good intentions, but reigned too long and too passively when not a nice guy, but an evil genius like his father was required at the helm of state. Oops, I did it again is a common phrase uttered when you have a bad habit. It could be anything from forgetting your keys to spilling your coffee on your laptop. For the Roman Empire, it's having civil wars when their very survival is at stake, and the devastating impact of this bad habit is demonstrated in full in the 14th century Palaiologan civil wars. Two major ones will be today's focus in Eastern Rome summarized. Before we arrive at that stage, let's inspect the cause of coups and revolts in the first place: incompetent leadership. For you see, as controversial and despotic Michael VIII Palaiologos was in his reign, no serious usurper threatened his rule. But his son Andronikos II, a much gentler man, through his mismanagement of the empire, brought the strife upon himself. We last stopped in 1302, where complete chaos reigned in Anatolia. To counter the Ottomans, Andronikos hired the Catalan company of Roger de Flor. His father's previous cooperation with King Peter of Aragon during the Sicilian Vespers established contact between Romania and Spain, so it wasn't hard to find Almogavers eager for gold. In 1303, the Catalans arrived in Constantinople, posing extravagant demands and clashing with the Genoese. But what could Andronikos do except try to placate them and ship them to Anatolia as soon as possible? He was extremely desperate. He asked the Ilkhan Ghazan for help too, and he also planned to confiscate all the monastic properties in Bithynia to fund an army, which not even the recently restored hyper-spiritual patriarch Athanasius I opposed. In these tough times, he was brought back, as the Roman people missed having higher-ups so concretely help them. Palaiologan officials either didn't want to help, like Theodoros Metochitis, or weren't able to help, like co-emperor Michael IX, who retreated after his debacle in Magnesia and wanted to take the field again, but fell ill. The Catalans, who should be helping, treated Asian Romans worse than Turks or even Crusaders ever did. But their brutality was effective against the Turks, and they cleared Kyzikos of invaders by the start of 1304. Only Kyzikos came out in a worse state than under the Turks. The Catalans went to Philadelphia next. They took their sweet time fighting the Romans' allied troops and plundering more Roman lands on the way before liberating the city. After dumping their loot at Magnesia, they did crush a coalition of Turkish beyliks at Kibistra, and after that they even considered advancing into Cilicia for Andronikos, but their captains refused. Well, they really should have gone on, because their presence in western Anatolia only worsened things for the Romans. And when the Romans and allies in Magnesia refused to let the rowdy Catalans in, they turned on the Romans and besieged the city. Meanwhile, Rome recovered some eastern Aegean islands with help from Genoese adventurers. After many complaints, Andronikos finally recalled the Catalans back west to help Michael IX fight the Bulgarians. The Tsar Theodore Sviatoslav invaded eastern Thrace, and Michael IX, despite many initial successes, failed his counterattack at Skafida River. Thus Michael VIII's Bulgarian gains were lost, and Michael IX now had to receive the most insufferable mercenaries ever, who not only didn't help at all, but incited distrust among his Roman and Alan troops. The Catalan fleet was also sent to Roger to further his plans for the empire, but their armada was lost to the Genoese after fighting over not fighting the Romans. Then, an Alan murdered Roger for a vendetta in 1305, and the Catalans went berserk, blaming Michael IX. Not even pretending to fight for the empire anymore, they looted Thrace like mad, raping and pillaging with Turks and Bulgarians. Michael IX tried to stop them at Apros, but he took heavy losses and retreated. The traumatic devastation of Thrace in the next years cannot be described with words, and we're not even discussing the internal dissent, as Andronikos suffered an attempt on his life from a radical arsonite. And oh yes, did I even mention the city suffered a famine due to the influx of Thracian refugees? Now Andronikos had to rely on the Genoese to check the Catalans. The pirate Andrea Morisco patrolled the Hellespont, stopping Turks from crossing over to join the Catalans, and he was thanked by gaining Aegean islands as fiefs, but he was captured before he could claim them. Andronikos asked Genoa for more ships in 1306, but he was unable to pay the full price, so he kept what he could to patrol the straits, and after Morisco freed himself, the Romans and Genoese unsuccessfully besieged the Catalans' Thracian capital, Gallipoli. But Catalans were powerless against fortified Roman cities like Adrianople, and in winter, Andronikos applied the scorched earth policy in Thrace. The Catalans felt that they exhausted this region. To satisfy their infinite greed, they had to move south. They went for Macedonia in 1307, bringing plight to Mount Athos. Andronikos also settled peace with Bulgaria, and they kept their conquests. In Anatolia, Andronikos' plea to the Ilkhanate gave hope to the Romans. His half-sister Mary of the Mongols came to rally the citizens of Nicaea, promising Mongol aid. The Turks panicked and conquered Trikokia fort, isolating Nicaea, but by the next year, the Ilkhan's army arrived and crushed the Ottomans, relieving Bithynia for now. At this point, my reliable historian Georgios Pachymeres stops writing, so events later are muddier and briefer, but we can still conclude the Catalan episode. By the end of 1308, the Almogavers besieged Thessaloniki, hoping to make it their Macedonian capital, but fierce local Roman resistance, led by the Anatolian Roman general Andronikos, drove them further south. In 1309, they arrived in Thessaly, ruled by Ioannis II Doukas, who was Constantinople's ally and cooperated with Andronikos to force the Catalans even further south, out of Roman territory into Latin Greece. While the Catalans no longer bothered the Romans, they left the Turkish warband in Thrace, who continued freely raiding. So in sum, the Catalans not only filled their jobs to stop the Turks in Asia, they also brought the first Turks to Europe. Yay! The hopeless situation in the empire was felt by all, including Patriarch Athanasius, who just had enough and resigned. After this, and having their Anatolian operations ruined by the Turks, the Arsenites finally reunited with the imperial church in 1310, ending the schism. Andronikos also signed a new treaty with Venice, making them less of a pain, but Rhodes was lost forever, as Knights Hospitaliers finished conquering the island. The Duke of Athens hired the Catalans, but they betrayed him and took the duchy in 1311, settling in Athens afterwards. Things finally seemed more chill for the empire, except for the Turks ravaging Thrace, but in 1313, a Romano-Serb army massacred them. For the 1310s decade, I have very little sources, so I'll just breeze through. The Romans recovered from the mess and their poverty a bit, but corrupt statesmen like Michael VIII never ran out of cash, and he displayed his wealth by rebuilding the Hora church to its amazing form today. He then started learning astronomy around this time, as was the fad among the Roman literati of his day after the Trapezuntine scholar Grigorios Gioniadis returned from Iran teaching Persian astronomy. Metohites learned quickly and took on the future major Roman historian, the young polymath Nikephoros Grigoras, as his pupil. A good time for Roman science, but in 1316, the death of Oljaitu, the Ilkhan who saved the Romans before, saw Turks encroach on Anatolia again. Half of Smyrna was taken in 1317 by Turks from Aydin. This beylik would be important in Roman history, along with the Ottomans. Epirus and Thessaly saw their end too in 1318. Despot Thomas was murdered by his nephew Nicola Orsini, the Latin Count of Kefalonia, who took southern Epirus, while Romans in Ioannina and the north rejoined the empire. Ioannis II of Thessaly died too in 1318. His southeastern realm was seized by Catalans, while the northwest went to a local magnate who ruled the area in Andronikos' name. Orsini too sought imperial approval and obtained the title of despot in 1319, but Epirus was a Latin state, no longer a Roman one. And now we finally get to the civil wars. Andronikos II's successor was always Michael IX, followed by his sons Andronikos III and Manuel. Problem was, Andronikos III was a youthful troublemaker, the kind that proves the statement, boys will be boys, and Manuel was accidentally killed during his brother's pursuit of a woman. The news broke the already broken Michael IX, who died, and Andronikos II disowned his scandalous grandson, who wasn't going to take this lightly. With his best friend Ioannis Kanagouzinos and the support of the younger generations of the Roman aristocracy, Andronikos III revolted in 1321. Many Romans longed for a more energetic leadership and less taxes. Andronikos III offered them both. The Thracians instantly hailed him as emperor after he removed all their taxes. Andronikos II was mad, but his grandson's ally, Syrianis Palaiologos, led an army towards him, so he gave in, and Andronikos III was made co-emperor of Thrace. But the Syrianis was a devious bastard, and what could have been a bloodless revolution resumed as war because he defected to Andronikos II in hopes of more reward. In 1322, he egged on Andronikos II to attack, only for Andronikos III to prevail and become co-emperor of the whole empire after the two Androniki reached an accord. Syrianis despaired and tried to murder Andronikos II to become emperor himself, but he was caught and imprisoned. The young Andronikos III and Kanakouzenos protected the empire better than the old emperor. Bulgarians who took Philippopolis were driven back and the city was retaken, along with Mesembria in 1323, and a Mongolian invasion of Thrace was also defeated in 1324, but these feats were limited to Europe. In Andronikos II's part of the empire, he was being bullied by the Venetians again, and Turks took advantage of the civil war to attack. The city of Philadelphia was threatened, and the desperate old Vasilevs pardoned the old and blind Alexios Philanthropinos, whose name gave the Turks PTSD, and they fled. So he relieved the city and became its governor. Once more, Anatolia owed thanks to the Belisarius of the Palaiologan era, while the historian who bestowed upon him this title, the young astronomer Nikephoros Gregoras, proposed accurate reforms to the Julian calendar, which Andronikos II refused out of fear of dissension in the church, and the credit would later go to the Gregorian calendar's inventor. Osman died about this time, but his son Orhan took the Ottomans to new heights. No more minor gains, major cities would fall too. Prusa was taken in 1326 and became his capital. Where were the Roman emperors? On the brink of another round of civil war, as Andronikos II's nephew, the governor of Thessaloniki, allied with the Serbs and rebelled. He soon died, but Andronikos III's faction suspected his grandfather of foul play, and both Androniki prepared for conflict. Andronikos II continued allying with Serbia, while in 1327 Andronikos III allied with Bulgaria. By bringing foreign powers into civil wars, they set a dangerous example for future dynastic struggles, but for now, the ensuing clash between the old and the young Vasilevs wasn't that disastrous for the populace. As most Romans knew, supporting the lively Andronikos III was the safest bet. Serbia didn't help Andronikos II, and Bulgaria tried to betray their ally, but the old Vasilevs refused their help too. By 1328, almost all Roman cities declared for Andronikos III, who was marching on the city too. Andronikos II lost all allies except for Metochites, whose mansion was the only significant property collateral of this war. The two were gently removed from power, and Andronikos III became emperor, promising rejuvenation for Rome. In Andronikos II's long and depressing reign, the empire was reduced greatly. Anatolia had no hope for recovery anymore, and the Balkan powers bit their chunk out of Romania too. Rogue mercenaries had held the empire at its throat, and a first civil war destabilized the Palaiologan regime. Not to mention the inflation and other troubles with administration. We could blame Andronikos II, but it's worth keeping in mind too that the Eastern Empire itself was 1,000 years old by the point. Romania was an old state in an ever-shifting world of the late Middle Ages. Of course it would get bullied by new, vigorous ones. Andronikos II was too conservative and timid to meet these challenges, but Andronikos III was not. The new Vasilevs rewarded his followers, but especially his friend Kanakouzenos, the brains behind his operations. His upstart follower, Alexios Apollakos, was also rewarded. Even Syrianis was freed and given Thessaloniki in 1329. These two wouldn't be as loyal as Kanakouzenos, who immediately followed the Vasilevs to relieve Orhan's siege of Nicaea. The ensuing Battle of Pelikanon saw the first engagement between a Roman emperor and an Ottoman sultan, but it was also telling that the Romans were routed. Andronikos III retreated, and never again would an imperial army cross to Asia. Anatolia was abandoned. Andronikos did manage to retake Chios from the Zaccaria, who claimed the island as they defended it from the Turks, and he also reasserted his authority in the Anatolian Genoese fief of Phocaea. But the remaining Roman cities of western Anatolia would be picked off one by one by the Sultanate of Orhan, which was absorbing Roman administration fast and shaping quickly into the empire we know it as. But to be optimistic, Roman rule continued in the northeast, in Trebizond, and flourished, at least until his great Vasilevs Alexios II Megas Komnenos died of plague in 1330, Then Trebizond became plagued by what just affected their compatriots in Constantinople, civil war. But I promised, I'll save Trapezuntine history for another day. Back to Andronikos, he settled a treaty with his shifty ally Bulgaria, who had just been defeated by Serbia, the ascendant Balkan power. It got more ascendant in 1331 as Stefan IV Dusan took the throne. He had eyes on Macedonia. He wouldn't be known as Dusan the Mighty for nothing. Meanwhile, Lycia fell to the Ottomans. Its inhabitants couldn't take the siege anymore and surrendered to their new overlords, who did a remarkable job incorporating the Romans into the new system. In 1332, Andronikos invaded Bulgaria but backfired, and he lost Mesembria and Anchialos. But the magnate who ruled western Thessaly in Andronikos II's name died in 1333, and Andronikos went down to claim it for the empire. Then he discovered the treachery of Syrianis, who was arrested but fled to Dusan. I told you he was trouble. In Anatolia, Andronikos paid Orhan to leave his remaining Bithynian cities alone, and the Turks of Aydin got a new leader in 1334, their most famous hero Umar Bey, whose acts of piracy had already irritated the Latins. Their interests were at stake, and they planned a crusade. They were willing to even let the schismatic Greeks join in. Andronikos danced carefully around these offers, which was the wise course of action, as Kanakouzinos urged him to ally with Aydin. Plus, the Latins' venture failed. The Vasilevs did realize the dangers of Turkish piracy, and he had been rebuilding a Roman fleet, though this was of no help in Macedonia, where the traitor Syrianis took major cities like Ohrid and Kastoria for Serbia. The bastard got what he deserved. The Romans assassinated him, but the damage was done, and Andronikos had to make up for his losses in Europe by looking towards Epirus, whose Orsini ruler died in 1335. Meanwhile, the Genoese seized Lesbos, confirming Andronikos' belief that the Latins were less reliable allies in the Aegean than the Turks, so he officially allied with Aydin, and Kanakouzinos started a lifelong friendship with Umar. However, it would be the bane of the Turks, Alexis Philanthropinos, who retook the island and Phocaea in 1336, becoming governor of Lesbos. The Roman Aydinid alliance was supposed to check Ottoman power too, but Orhan conquered the Karasid Beylik anyway, and enlarged his realm to the Aegean coast. Gradually, he stopped caring about Andronikos' tributes and conquered Nicomedia too in 1337. Philanthropinos stopped the Turkish attack of Lesbos, but it was clear that the Turks were getting too powerful at sea. Kanakouzinos still liked this Aydin alliance though, as he and Andronikos borrowed Turks from Umar to crush Albanian bandits in northern Epirus, then took advantage of the despot's weakness to annex it in 1338. But its despot, Nikiforos II Orsini, was shipped off to the titular Latin Empress of Constantinople, Catherine, in Taranto, who later stirred up Epirot rebellions from the Morea. Orsini returned to Epirus too in 1339, but Andronikos sent forth an army, and the next year he restored order in Epirus. Kanakouzinos convinced the Epirots to surrender and give up Orsini, so Constantinople finally retook all the old Komnenos lands in Greece, an impressive feat in these days. But it doesn't matter, all these gains in the west would soon be lost to Serbia. In 1341, Andronikos convened a synod to discuss the matter of hesychasm, which I'll explain in a bit, before dying of illness. He was the last Roman emperor to initiate a military revival for the empire, even if his gains would all soon be lost to civil war. Internally, he reformed the system too, limiting corruption and rejuvenating Roman law. The last great Eastern Roman law book, the Hexabiblos of Konstantinos Harmenopoulos, who served as judge under him, would be published soon after his death. Yes, I'm using the word last a lot. We are entering the final decline with the Second Palaiologan Civil War. This one started out like the one after Caesar's death. Who should succeed Andronikos, his friend or his son? Instead of Mark Antony, the friend was Ioannis VI Kanakouzinos. Instead of Octavian, the son was Ioannis V Palaiologos. Palaiologos was just a boy, so Kanakouzinos was his regent. However, when he left the capital to protect the empire, a coup by Patriarch Ioannis Kalekas and Apokavkos made Palaiologos' mother, Anna of Savoy, his regent. Kanakouzinos was smart. He should have realized the empire didn't need a civil war now. But Kanakouzinos was proclaimed emperor in Didmotichon, and the two sides of the civil war polarized the empire. Not only was there class conflict, aristocrats rallying around Kanakouzinos and commoners around Palaiologos, but also religious clash. Hesychasm was a monastic tradition developed on Mount Athos, which recovered from the Catalan raids and now grew in fame. This attracted attention from a Calabrian monk, who, being trained in scholastic Latin theology, was horrified by the contemplative, mystical nature of the Athonite practice. This sparked the most serious Roman ecclesiastical dispute since iconoclasm, as the monk Grigorios Palamas rushed to hesychasm's defense. Kanakouzenos aristocrats liked Palamas' conservative orthodox position, so Kalaikas, as a political opponent, had to declare against hesychasm. But it was still mostly a class struggle in the highly unequal Palaiologan world, with the hypocritically rich Apokavkos posing as the champion of the poor. But I'll stop examining society before I start sounding like a Marxist historian. Unfortunately, what followed would delight the Marxists, as I must now introduce you to Byzantine communists. In 1342, Kanakouzenos' friend offered him Thessaloniki, and he accepted, but before he could claim it, its aristocracy was ousted by the Zealots, anti-aristocratic radicals who set up their own regime in Thessaloniki and redistributed elite property. Apokavkos sent his men to reinforce Thessaloniki, but it was an autonomous city for the time being. This cut off Kanakouzenos from his base in Demetrios, so he resorted to allying with Dushan, who had been looking for an excuse to re-enter Roman politics and gain Macedonia. Kanakouzenos was too desperate to say no. With Serbian help, he held out. His wife, Irina Sanina in Demetrios, held out too against treacherous Bulgarian allies. The couple's stubbornness paid off as their savior Umor arrived in 1343, relieving them both. Umor besieged Thessaloniki to no avail except causing famine, while Kanakouzenos broke with Dushan due to him taking over Veria, a city the latter coveted. Dushan then allied with the regency, who gave him free rein to invade Macedonia, while Kanakouzenos plundered the Thracian countryside with his Turks. Anna of Savoy used this to ask the West for help, and she pawned the Roman crown jewels to Venice for quick cash. How far the Romans had fallen. Serbs and Turks running aloof in European provinces, and the royal family selling their dignity to Venice. Wait, don't forget the Bulgarians, to whom the regency had to give Philippopolis to ally with. In 1344, the Latins attacked Aydin for their own ends, so the Turks had to go home. On the way, they slightly halted Dushan's lightning conquest by beating him at Stefaniana, but he had everything west of Kavala except for Thessaloniki, Veria, and Seres, which he besieged in 1345. Kanakouzenos tried to stop him, but then Apokavkos was lynched in the city, so he rushed to Constantinople, only to find the chaos settled before he could exploit it. Apokavkos' son offered Thessaloniki to Kanakouzenos, but again this was discovered and the Zealots murdered him. And Umar was pegged down by Latins in Smyrna, so Kanakouzenos had to find other Turkish allies, the Ottomans. Huge mistake. Bringing Serbia into the war saw Dushan's conquest of Macedonia, and once he took Seres, in 1346 he proclaimed himself Emperor of the Serbs and Romans, making Serbia an empire trying to replace Romania, like Simeon of Bulgaria. Kanakouzenos reacted by formally crowning himself with the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Likewise, Ottoman entry into the civil war was also dreadful for Roman Europe, which they now will begin to snatch as their presence there increased. And the Genoese took Chios and Phocaea again. In short, Rome was preyed on by vultures, while Kanakouzenos and Palaiologos exhausted themselves. In 1347, the war finally ended. Anna fell out with Kalaikas, and Kanakouzenos assaulted her palace. They agreed that he was to be senior emperor until Palaiologos was older, just like 6 years ago. Well, so many resources wasted for nothing. Kanakouzenos' victory was also that of Palamism. A synod deposed Kalaikas and elected a Palamist patriarch, but not all who supported Kanakouzenos liked Palamism. Rigoras, for example, attributed the failings of the state to this doctrine, aggressively attacking Palamas. Thus, hesychast debates continued, while the Romans had uneasy peace and Serbia took Epirus. Then the most horrible danger struck, the Black Death. Not since the plague of Justinian did the Romans suffer such a great natural disaster, adding to the hopelessness and misery of the time. Many were killed, including Kanakouzenos, governor of Thessaly, in 1348. Dushan then slipped in and seized the last of Andronikos III's conquests. He dreamed of conquering the whole Roman Empire, but he wasn't the only one. Orhan sent Kanakouzenos some Turks to fight the Serbs, but they just plundered Macedonia and got to know the land better. The Roman state sunk into more plight and had to fight the Genoese for customs over the Bosphorus. Kanakouzenos' son Manuel and his wife Irene valiantly defended the city against them, but he still lost in 1349, though Chios and Phocia returned to Roman rule. Manuel then became despot of Morea. The Vasilevs hoped to retake the whole south, as the Serb presence kept growing in the north. They almost had Thessaloniki in 1349, but Kanakouzenos saved the empire's second city, ridding it of zealots and Serbs in 1350. He had a mini resurgence in Macedonia, retaking Veria and Servia from Dusha. In 1351, Kanakouzenos returned home, where he saw a council of the ultimate triumph of hesychasm, now officially orthodox doctrine. He kept church independence, but lost state autonomy, having to fight Genoa during its war with Venice, but he failed, wasting more imperial resources. Venice also abandoned him, so he settled with Genoa on his own in 1352. Now, Italians and Serbs all wanted a weaker emperor in Constantinople. They targeted Ioannis V. Rebellion was incited, but Kanakouzenos convinced Anna to reason with her son. Just as it seemed the threat passed, Ioannis V fought with Kanakouzenos' son Matthäus over their allotted territory. So, civil war again! Palaiologos had the Serbs and Bulgarians, while Kanakouzenos turned to his Turkish pals, who were the better warriors and crushed Balkaners. But Thracian Romans had enough of him using infidels like this, and his popularity waned. He sent Palaiologos to Tenedos and crowned Matthäus as co-emperor in 1353, to the displeasure of many. He didn't have much time left on the throne, and his friendship with the Ottomans would haunt him. Orhan's son, Suleiman, wasn't as reasonable as his father, and he took minor forts in Thrace during his adventures there. Then in 1354, an earthquake devastated the Thracian coast, destroying Gallipoli. The Ottomans occupied and rebuilt the ruined city, now having a permanent foothold in Europe. Kanakouzenos tried to ask Gallipoli back nicely, in vain. Also, Ioannis V refused to reconciliate, and he snuck out of Tenedos to regain Constantinople, ousting the unpopular Kanakouzenos from power, who abdicated on December 9th and became a monk. And here is where to stop, as Ioannis V would sadly be the emperor and protagonist of the next video. He was another Andronikos II, a weak emperor who reigned way too long and put the empire in irreversible misfortune. As for Kanakouzenos, how to assess him? A talented man who lived in troubled times. He had potential. Had the civil war not erupted, and he carried through his plans with Andronikos III, it's likely the empire would have recovered, but no. Civil war saw the empire shrink to just Constantinople, a bit of Thrace, Thessaloniki, the Morea, some Aegean islands, and scattered, isolated cities. What can we learn from this video? Never fight civil wars when your survival is at stake. But the fact is still that he was the prime culprit for the future Turkish conquest of the Balkans. Last time we ended with Ottoman victory in Asia, this time in Europe. Kanakouzenos knew he messed up. He wrote a massive history to justify his actions in the civil wars and using Turks. But under him, Rome still had some agency. His successor would see that agency vanish and become an Ottoman vassal. Depressing. I'll announce this outright. We may have reached the darkest period of Roman history. The depression the Romans felt and the humiliations the empire suffered in the late 14th century may be unparalleled in its 2 millennia-long existence. Roman dignity was at stake like never before, like its survival, and there is even a lack of Roman historians for those embarrassing days. The Palaiologan Renaissance was attaining its zenith. The polity of the Romans saw no lack of bright intellectuals urgently trying to fan up their national pride, but they were kinda unwilling to record their present affairs for us, preferring instead to dwell on ancient glories and spread their classical learning to the Italians. How did we get to this stage? Eastern Rome Summarized is here to narrate to you the events which reduced the Roman Empire to beggary. Ioannis V Palaiologos was shortly Vasilevs by 1355, but his future fate of being the most pathetic Roman emperor ever is foreshadowed by the fact that he was broke and in debt to Venice from his civil war. He wasn't optimistic about his future either. The Turks were already entrenched in Europe, and he felt help could only come from the Latins. Perhaps himself being half Italian let him trust Italian powers more. He handed 2 valuable Roman islands, Chios and Lesbos, to the Genoese, as he felt he could no longer defend them from Turks. He also wrote to the Pope a desperate sellout letter with the aid of the Latin bishop of Smyrna, Paul. He was willing to abandon his Orthodox faith, instruct his eldest son, Andronikos IV, in Latin fashion, and give his younger son, Manuel II, to the papacy as a hostage. Ioannis was practically signaling to the world that in return for a meager aid, the Vasilevs could lower himself tremendously, and his later humiliations from his powerful neighbors resulted primarily from his own willingness to be submissive. One neighbor wouldn't trouble him anymore, luckily. Emperor Dusan of Serbia. He died at the apex of his career. He was about to take Constantinople too, and his death ended the Serbian imperialist threat. Later, Serbs made for better potential allies than enemies, as they too, like the Romans, became a Balkan Orthodox people preyed on by the Turks, but for now, they were still happy to serve with Turks together in Roman civil conflicts. Kanakousinos may have retired without a fuss, but his son Mattheos didn't. He extended the civil war and marched on the capital in 1356, only for his Serbs to betray him to Ioannis. The next year, Mattheos was sent to Lesbos, and he had to swear fealty to Ioannis, ending the Palaiologis clash with the Kantakouzini. Meanwhile, the Pope read Ioannis' letter and didn't think much of it. He sent papal envoys to Constantinople for propaganda, who allegedly converted Ioannis to Catholicism, but not a lot of people believed that. Yet with or without Ioannis' applications, an anti-Turkish Christian League was being constituted anyway, as growing Turkish power seriously impeded Latin activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Ottomans weren't invincible yet. Orhan's eldest son, the Gazi Suleiman, who was spearheading the Turkish conquest of Europe, died suddenly, while his youngest son, Khalil, also a grandson of Kanakousinos, was taken by Phocaean pirates. The Ottomans were still at the mercy of the Christians at sea, and Orhan needed Ioannis to get the unhappy governor of Phocaea to release the prince in 1358. He paid Ioannis handsomely and agreed to engage Khalil to the daughter of the Vasilevs, who may have planned to ensure his nephew-in-law's succession to the Ottoman throne. It'd be ideal for the Romans to have one of their own ruling the Turks, who recently briefly took Dymoteichon in 1359. They were penetrating dangerously deep into Thrace, but the Pope's League raiding Turks at Lampsakos gave Ioannis some hope of solid Latin help, and he would be desperate enough to do anything to get it. Oh, do you hear that? That's the sound of the Turks permanently taking Dymoteichon in 1361, after a brief expulsion. Thus fell the capital of Kantakousinos, as did the fortune of his family, who used to be so prominent in the empire. Mattheos and his kin all had to move to the Morea, where his brother, Manuel Kantakousinos, the first despot of Morea, ruled the province solidly, but they would never play a huge role in imperial history again. So Ioannis was rid of his rival for good, but his administration in no way rivaled that of Manuel in the Morea. As a plague ravaged the city by 1362, Constantinople became more depressing by the day, and nobody wanted to stay there anymore, not even the emperor. And meanwhile, Sultan Orhan died. His son Murad I succeeded him. The funny thing about Ottomans was that their first 4 sultans possessed each the aggression and the might of their predecessor squared. As Orhan far surpassed Osman in his successes, so was Murad miles more bellicose and powerful than Orhan, and Murad's son, Bayezid, was a downright terror, but we will save him for later, as he could only be dealt with by Ioannis' son, Manuel II, the unfortunate prince of such enormous capabilities that he would have flourished in any other era. Ioannis could barely cope with even Murad. He instantly signed a treaty with the new sultan and hoped for the best. But what best was there to hope for from the eventual conqueror of most of the Balkans? In 1363, Philippopolis was conquered by Lala Shahin, who was then named Ottoman governor of Rumelia, the European Roman lands. Guess who's here to stay for good? Ioannis panicked. He ratified a treaty with Venice to patrol the straits, to no result. His patriarch Callistos was sent to get Serbian aid, with no result. Bulgaria felt indifferent, and Romans had to raid Black Sea ports to prevent their collaboration with Turks. Neighboring Christians simply felt this was not their problem, and they would soon realize their error. Now, the only hope for the Romans was news of a grand crusade led by Hungary and Cyprus. By 1364, the more Latinophile among the Romans, along with their emperor, were very supportive of any ideas of a crusade. Desperation could sway opinions like nothing else. This was fully endorsed by the most Latinophile of Latinophiles, the young scholar Demetrios Kydones, who returned to public affairs in 1364 after some long time off to pursue his study of Latin philosophy. He was polemical, aggressive, and one might even call him a Latin sellout, but he was fascinating, and I wish I could talk more about him, but time constraints. You just need to know that he was first taken under the wing of Cantacuzinos, who saw his immense potential and encouraged him to learn Latin. He spearheaded the Greco-Latin cultural exchange, and being fluent in the tongue of the ancient Romans, he translated and studied many Latin works. 3 emperors adored and employed him. He was more responsible for the education of Manuel II than the boy's petty excuse of a father, Ioannis. So I guess we have him to thank for instructing the best of the Palaiologan emperors. But by 1365, he also converted to Catholicism, so yeah, he was a controversial guy. Not the most popular man at parties with all his Latin praising, anti-Palamism, and endless attempts to preach for church union and for the Romans to embrace their Western brothers in Christ. In following years, more Roman intellectuals would follow his lead, convert to the Latin faith, and immigrate to Italy to read books in peace and teach ancient Greek wisdom to the Latins. For the brightest among the Romans, this future, away from their homes, was the brightest they could hope for, and whenever this happens, you can be sure that a state is decaying. Sorry for the long rant. Yes, about the crusade. It launched for Egypt instead of at the Turks, and the king of Hungary, Louis, didn't even join as he was busy being a good papist boy and bashing the Orthodox by taking Bulgaria Vidin. Why in the world Ioannis thought it would be a good idea to ask for help from this guy, in person, is beyond me. I'm simply too dumb to understand his political wisdom. The first time a Roman emperor visited a foreign land to beg for aid. Ioannis met Louis in Buda, and after months of empty talk, he was only allowed to leave by leaving his son Manuel II as a hostage in Hungary. Even then, Ioannis couldn't go home, as the Bulgarian Tsar trapped him in Vidin due to beef with both Hungary and Rome. His son in Constantinople, Andronikos IV, offered no help at all. Just when the Roman Empire hit peak embarrassment, surprise salvation came from the Latins in 1366. Ioannis' cousin, Count Amadeo of Savoy, funded a personal expedition against the Turks and to save his helpless kinsman. He joined forces with some men from the Roman army in Lesbos and retook Gallipoli for the empire with no fuss. A Latin offering solid help without a billion conditions did warm the Romans' hearts, but Kydones still needed to give a whole speech about how the Latins were Western Romans to convince them to let Amadeo's army into the city. Understandable, the trauma from 1204 didn't fade easily. Ioannis soon heard about his cousin's arrival and wrote to him. Amadeo immediately set out to terrorize Bulgaria to save him. The Savoyard fleet took most of their Black Sea coastal cities, and the Tsar had to let Ioannis go. The next year, the cousins met. Ioannis had to pay for Amadeo's Bulgarian expedition, and he got those Black Sea cities. But now this seems almost too good to be true. Why were the Latins being this fair? Then Amadeo cut to the point. Union. The Pope wanted the submission of the Romans, and while submissive Ioannis was eager to convert, the rest of the Romans weren't. The monk Cantacuzinos ardently opposed papal supremacy, and voiced the opinion of his people. Union must only be discussed in an ecumenical council, with all of the pentarchy attending. This seemed like a nice idea, and after Amadeo cleared out Turks in the vicinity of Constantinople, he left, reminding Ioannis to come to Italy soon for the sake of union. The Roman clergy excitedly awaited the ecumenical council. In vain. The Pope had no interest in open discussion and expected only the unconditional recognition of his authority. Soon the Romans realized that they were played false, and Latinophobia rose again. In 1368, the Palamites bullied Prochoros Kydones, the brother of that high Palatinophile Kydones, who was then preparing for the emperor's coming journey to Old Rome. Ioannis too was being bullied by Venetians. The crown jewels that he pawned were still in Venice, and they wanted a lot, or they'd sell the jewels. So Ioannis haggled until he arrived in Italy in 1369. His trip was not the most joyous of affairs, but finally in October, the Roman emperor arrived in Rome. The last time this happened was in Constans II's day, in 663. This time, however, the Roman emperor kissed the feet of the pontiff and submitted fully to the pope, in public. Now the pope was satisfied and saw Ioannis as a devout Catholic prince, worthy of calling a crusade for. He damn well needed a crusade, because back in the east, the Ottomans seized Adrianople, and Murad made it his new capital. The race was getting more Turkish by the day, while Ioannis was stuck in Italy and forced by the papacy to declare his Catholicism. The next year, the pope wrote to the Eastern Romans to follow the emperor, but nobody gave a damn, and the pope was powerless to stir a crusade anyway, so again neither side fulfilled their promise. Ioannis then became the first Roman emperor to visit Venice, to barter over his imperial dignity. He proposed to sell Tenedos to pay his debts and get the jewels back. But back in Constantinople, Andronikos IV was urged by his Genoese friends to refuse this offer, and the Venetians detained the ever more broke Ioannis in Venice. Only when Manuel II personally rescued him with bail money could the Vasilevs go home in 1371, with no Western aid and even poorer. This decade was truly a momentous one for the Ottomans. They started with a bang. Some Serbian nobles united and assembled a large army to crush the Turks, but Lala Shahin and another Ottoman veteran, Evrenos Bey, slaughtered the Serbs in Maritsa River in a night raid. Christian resistance crumbled in the Balkans. In the following years, the Ottomans vassalized most of these rulers. The Serbs took a hard hit, but they were still the only lot who actively did something against the Turks, and even Kydones was thinking of allying with them when he realized that Andronikos IV had been willing to negotiate the surrender of Gallipoli to Murad in his father's absence. Kydones' pupil Manuel II couldn't sell his empire's honor like his father and brother, and he was the only Roman doing something in all this chaos. Ruling from Thessaloniki, he began to reconquer the Macedonian lands lost to the Serbs, starting from Ceres. The next year, the Turks besieged Ceres, but Manuel drove them off. In contrast, Ioannis chickened out before them. Historians speculate that right then, Ioannis submitted as a vassal to Murad. The chronology is very confusing, but I assure you that the Romans were Ottoman slaves by the end of the 1370s, no matter who bowed down, Ioannis or Andronikos, as Kaldelis claims. For the first time, the Roman Empire was subordinate, obliged to pay tribute and fight by the Sultan's side, right after kissing the Pope's feet. I'd laugh it wasn't so sad. Get ready for more pointless self-harm. It's 4th Palaiologan Civil War time. In 1373, Andronikos IV had enough of his father and revolted, but not alone. He did so with his fellow youthful rebel, Savci Bey, son of Murad, and the Ottomans found themselves working with their Roman vassals to quell the rebellion of their princes. Having seen Murad's might, surely you won't doubt that the young men were put down. Showing his paternal affection, Murad blinded Savci and later executed him. He forced his vassal Ioannis to do the same, but the Palaiologi took care to be more humane since Michael VIII blinded his Lascarid predecessor, and Ioannis only half-blinded his son and his grandson, the future Ioannis VII, who were imprisoned and disinherited. This made Manuel II officially the co-emperor and heir, which, if Andronikos didn't escape later, would have been great for the empire, as Manuel was competent, and this shows in how he re-established Roman authority in Macedonia, though he confiscated monastic lands for military use, so he wasn't insanely popular with those who refused to see the bigger picture, but still he was a better choice for the emperor than his brother. Andronikos languished in jail for 3 years, until Ioannis sold Tenedos to Venice, and the jealous Genoese bailed him out of prison to protect their commercial interests. First thing Andronikos did? Promised Tenedos to the Genoese and Gallipoli to Murad. With his foreign armies, Emperor Andronikos IV took Constantinople, then imprisoned Ioannis V and his brothers, Manuel and Theodoros, who too suffered in prison for 3 years. But Manuel developed an insane fraternal bond with Theodoros, his only competent brother. This would help the empire in the future. The Genoese went for Tenedos, but the Romans there were loyal to their vassals Ioannis, and they resisted with the Venetians, who assaulted the Genoese and Andronikos IV in Constantinople the next year. This spiraled into the War of Chioggia between Genoa and Venice, another squabble for Eastern Mediterranean trade colonization. Andronikos IV and his son Ioannis VII recovered some sight, and they were crowned. Then he ceded Gallipoli to Murad after a decade of Christian reoccupation. He campaigned as Murad's vassal, doing exactly what he despised his father for, and the empire was now more embroiled in Turkish and Italian affairs. Venice and Genoa finally took their fighting out of the empire after Venice failed to take Phocaea in 1378, and in 1379, Ioannis V escaped with his family to the court of Murad, who stopped supporting Andronikos IV because Ioannis sold out even more Roman dignity. A Turkish army and Venetian navy put Ioannis and Manuel back on the throne, but Andronikos escaped to Galata with Kanakouzenos and his daughters as hostage. So now we have a civil war right in Constantinople between Galata and the rest of the city, or rather, a war between the Genoese and the Venetians and Turks. In Greece, meanwhile, the Latin Navarrese Company conquered Thebes from the Catalan Company for their employer, Nerio Acciaioli, who would soon be the new Duke of Athens. Down south, Despot Manuel Kanakouzenos of Morea died after a successful reign in 1380, and Mattheos succeeded him, but clearly Mistra needed a more capable ruler, who came after the civil war ended in 1381, when the Palaiologi reached an accord. Andronikos IV and Ioannis VII were Ioannis V's heirs again, at Manuel's expense, and they stopped fighting. Kanakouzenos was freed, and he joined his family in the Morea, while Theodoros was appointed its new despot, though he had to fight a son of Mattheos for it. Later, the War of Chioggia ended too. Amadeo of Savoy mediated peace between Venice and Genoa. He took Tenedos and depopulated its Romans so they couldn't fight for it again. So all was happy, except, well, Manuel. He had been loyal to his idiot father forever, and now he was left out because Murad wanted it? Hell no. As soon as he finished his duties for Murad, he sailed for Thessaloniki and set himself up in 1382 as the Emperor of Thessaly in Macedonia, which he tried to retake for Rome. There, he also defied his father and warred against the Turks, relieving Serres, which he freed before, from an Ottoman siege. Oh my, a Roman military victory against the Turks. When did that last happen? Manuel proved his worth, and this prestige boosted from Constantinople to Epirus. His teacher Kydones, still in the city, told him how happy the people were. Thessaly, which the last Serb ruler, John Uroš, left to the Roman noble Alexios Angelos Philanthropinos, recognized Manuel's suzerainty, and Angelos was made a Caesar. Epirus, under the Serbian despot Thomas Prelibovic, the Albanian slayer, did the same. Basically, for the entirety of Manuel's 5-year rule in Thessaloniki, he held all of northern Greece, an insane feat for that day and age. Theodoros also firmly established himself as the despot of Morea in 1383, and the bros might have just ruled Greece happily ever after, but no. Murad was mad. He sent an army against Manuel, and Serres fell immediately, being plundered thoroughly. The Turks then besieged Thessaloniki, letting its citizens choose between servitude and slaughter. Manuel was ready to fight to the end, but he knew the Thessalonians would sell out their city to save their lives and property, so he gave an epic speech urging them to defend their freedom and heritage. His plea fell on deaf ears, as the socio-economic divide was simply too great in Thessaloniki for there to be a united resistance. That he even resisted for a few years was a miracle. His bishop abandoned Thessaloniki in 1384, and Manuel received almost no help. Despot Thomas of Epirus died. The Caesar of Thessaly probably sent him little aid too. He continued helping his brother Theodoros even in these times, although the despot of Morea was too caught up fighting Latins in the south with his new ally, Nerio Acciaioli, in 1385 to send help back. Manuel's appeal to the Venetians for help was rejected. In Constantinople, Andronikos almost started another civil war, but luckily he died. The Turks weren't idle while they laid siege to Thessaloniki. They conquered vast swaths of the Balkans. Sofia fell, then Nisus II in 1386. Even Mount Athos submitted to Ottoman authority. Bulgaria and Serbia were on the verge of being occupied, and the Serbian prince Lazar organized a Christian resistance while Murad had to return to Anatolia. The next year, Manuel became too discouraged by the Thessalonians and fled the city before Thessaloniki surrendered. The second city of the empire fell to the Ottomans. He escaped, and ironically, Manuel only found refuge with Murad in Bursa before his father Ioannis had to take him back into the empire. Poor Manuel was confined on Lemnos while the Ottomans continued the subjugation of the Balkans, although Lazar's efforts bore some fruit and helped defeat the Turks invading Bosnia in 1388. This pretty much united all Balkan Christians willing to fight, and Lazar led them against Murad and his son Bayezid at the decisive Battle of Kosovo on June 15, 1389. I will digress before I make this episode about Serbian history, as the legendary showdown at Kosovo has so many details and myths, but the gist was that both armies were destroyed, both Lazar and Murad died, but Bayezid became Sultan and finished his father's conquest, vassalizing Serbia. As I have already alluded, this Sultan was insanely ambitious and unstable, warring in Europe and Anatolia. And what were the Romans doing at this time? Still busy with their own squabbles, as Ioannis VII rallied support in Genoa against his grandfather Ioannis V. Just why? Manuel was allowed to return to Constantinople by an ill Ioannis V in case Ioannis VII came back with Genoese support, which the young man did in 1390, and he allied with Bayezid II to take the city. Again, Manuel had to save his father. He snuck out of the capital and returned with Latin aid to oust Ioannis VII. This started Bayezid's lifelong rivalry with Manuel. He wanted to play kingmaker like Murad, but failed, so the Romans, Manuel especially, would suffer for it. He forced his vassals, both Manuel and Ioannis VII, to campaign for him against Philadelphia, the last free Roman city of Western Asia Minor. Roman emperors warring against Romans in the final island of Romanitas, amongst an almost completely Turkish Anatolia. I'm so done. Meanwhile, Bayezid forced Ioannis V to demolish some of Constantinople's fortifications, or he'd blind Manuel, and the already deeply humiliated old Vasilevs had to comply. While Philadelphia was the last Roman city in the west of Anatolia, I'd like to kindly remind you all of the Empire of Trebizond, whose story I did promise to save for another time, but I must inform you of these developments. Their emperor, Alexios III Megas Komnenos, who worked for as long as Ioannis V but vigorously defended his realm against invaders in contrast, died, but not before allying with the Turkish emir in Erzincan. This emir then allied with a new eastern power, whose name spread fear from China to Anatolia. But before his arrival, Bayezid continued degrading the Romans, and Philadelphia fell in 1391. Ioannis V died, finally ending his miserable reign. I'm sure he was as frustrated with himself as we are with him, for it was his actions which reduced the Roman Empire into a beggar in the west and a slave in the east. He most probably died from self-loathing, as he wasn't even that old yet. I'm sorry if I seem harsh with him, but I'm just so done, and please let me just get on with Manuel II's reign. The Vasilevs fled from Bayezid's camp before the Sultan could try his tricks and entered Constantinople as the Emperor of the Romans. Kydones hailed his pupil as a philosopher king, but a small faction still supported Ioannis VII, so of course there was no Roman political unity even now. Bayezid flew into a flying rage, but was too tied up with his Anatolian Turkish enemies to murder Manuel, so he settled for extracting an inhumane amount of tribute from Constantinople and forcing Manuel to come back and campaign with him. The Vasilevs had to obey. He left his mother Eleni as a regent, then helped Bayezid subjugate his enemies on the Black Sea coast. My man was so depressed by seeing ruined ancient Greco-Roman cities and suffering Bayezid that his only consolation was by writing a theological dialogue. Luckily, the campaign was short, and Manuel went home in 1392, and he married, at last, to the Serbian lady Helena Dragas, mother of the last Roman emperor. The end is nearing. Then, Manuel also crowned himself in splendid ceremony, reminding his populace a last time of Roman cultural supremacy, a belief that he always held even in the toughest of days, though it was no secret that his empire was feeble, and his patriarch Antonios had to refute Moscow's claim that the emperor was not to be respected as the head of the Orthodox world anymore in 1393. Ottoman military threat also increased, as after a Bulgarian revolt was suppressed and their Tsar executed, the Bulgarian state just came to an end. Rome's greatest Balkan nemesis was suddenly just another Ottoman province. R.I.P. Bulgaria, you gave us centuries of showdowns with the Romans. Bayezid also began invading Greece with Avranos Bey. Thessaly, so recently restored under the rule of a Roman Caesar, was conquered. Then in winter, Bayezid summoned all his Balkan Christian vassal rulers in Ceres, so not only Manuel had to meet his least favorite person in the world, but Despot Theodoros and Ioannis VII all came too, and for Manuel, it felt as if they were all roosters coming for a carnage. And after suffering much psychological torment, Manuel dashed back to Constantinople in 1394. Theodoros was ordered to remain with Bayezid, but he was struck as well and fled back to the Morea. The despot had done so well for himself. Working with his father-in-law Nerio, he had expanded his pasture to Argos and Nafplia, but now he had to cede this to the Venetians, because, unsurprisingly, the Palaiologis escape provoked Bayezid, and the Ottomans began their final phase of the conquest of the Roman Empire. Nerio didn't bequeath Athens to Theodoros, but to Carlo Tocco of Cavalonia, who was afraid of the despot and called on the Turks against him. The full might of the Ottoman army under Avranos Bey fell upon Theodoros and the Latin-Greek princes, who, now having experienced the Turkish scimitar, finally stirred up some real sympathy in Western Europe. Avranos sacked Athens and terrorized the Morea, but despot Theodoros was able to hold him at bay, though not for long. Even more pressing was that, after Manuel refused to return to Bayezid again, the Sultan lashed out and blockaded Constantinople. Thus, the Queen of Cities was besieged once more. Hopelessness reigned more than ever in the capital, as Bayezid aimed to starve the Romans to submission. The Venetians took some pity and sent grain to the hungry people, and they even offered Manuel asylum in Venice, but the Vasilevs would not leave his capital yet. The following year, Constantinople moaned, while Theodoros endured Turkish onslaught in the Morea. He did, however, achieve some gains against Tocco and took Corinth, as the Turks had to face the threat of a crusade. The Latins were roused, and King Sigismund of Hungary led the crusade of Nicopolis with French allies. Bayezid briefly left the city to face 100,000 crusaders and massacre them, a disaster for Christians. Then Bayezid resumed his siege, and the Avranos returned to invading Greece. Manuel was devastated, and the Romans were growing restless, contemplating surrender or conversion to Islam. This must have given the Vasilevs PTSD of his days ruling Thessaloniki. Despair in the city was indescribable. Everyone was poor and suffering. Any respectable Roman with means would have already reached safer lands, like Manuel's friend, the scholar Manuel Laourdas, another pupil of Kydones. Doesn't he sound familiar to Renaissance enthusiasts among you? Laourdas was invited to teach Greek in Florence, and he would serve as the Vasilevs' important diplomat in the West. In 1397, the siege slightly relaxed, and Manuel right away began sending deputies to Latin rulers, who also began collecting money for the Romans. In the Morea, the Venetians refused to help Theodoros, and there Argos was sacked to the ground as karma. Theodoros' army was beaten at Leontarium by the Turks. The whole Peloponnese was ravaged and looted afterwards. In 1399, Marshal Boucicaut, a French veteran from Nicopolis, led soldiers to help Constantinople. Manuel was heartened, and he raided the Turks with Boucicaut, but it was not enough to save the city. Boucicaut then persuaded the Vasilevs to finally leave his capital and ask for help in Western Europe personally. He even convinced Ioannis VII to make up with his rival uncle to rule Constantinople in his absence. Manuel departed on his grand tour of the West, a journey which would bring him to provinces lost to the Roman Empire almost 1,000 years ago. The Vasilevs left his wife and sons with Theodoros, whose situation was also desperate, and asked Manuel for permission to sell Mistra to the Knights Hospitallers for defense against the Turks, which was approved, though Theodoros would later regret the decision, as the Turkish threat soon faded. That new eastern power I mentioned earlier was the terrifying Timur the Lame, and when Bayezid demanded tribute from Erzincan, Timur's vassal, the lame conqueror took offense. Now the Ottomans were his problem too, and it would be he who would save Constantinople, not the West, despite Manuel's impressive tour. By the turn of the 15th century, he arrived in Italy and was warmly welcomed. Ioannis V was received on humiliating terms, And though Manuel had to pursue his policy, he was able to utilize his personal charm and his belief in the merits of his own Roman culture to melt the hearts of the Latins. He was a beggar too, essentially, yes, but he didn't act like one. He traveled to Milan, where he met Laourdas and many Italians eager to accept Greek culture, and he represented his civilization at its best. The Pope was touched to call for crusades again. Manuel reached Paris in June, where King Charles VI welcomed him and promised more forces under Boucicaut. Then the Vasilevs went to England to meet King Henry IV. The two monarchs celebrated Christmas together, but Henry offered no concrete help. Nor did the other Latins, despite their fondness for Manuel, who returned to Paris in 1401 and tried negotiating with the kings in Iberia, and realized that no help was coming. But the Vasilevs was exhausted and decided to chill in Paris, while Constantinople was even more threatened. There, Ioannis VII sent envoys to Timur, who had already been insulted by Bayezid, and asked Trebizond and Genoa for ships. He was gonna give Bayezid an ass-whooping that even the Thunderbolt wouldn't expect. In 1402, right before the Romans and their French allies were about to break, Timur defeated Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara. Bayezid was captured, chained in an iron cage, and he died of shame next year. His Ottoman Empire disintegrated. Timur brutally plundered Anatolia, massacring Muslims and Christians, and he encouraged the other Turkish emirates to stay independent and for Bayezid's sons to fight. After leaving Asia Minor in chaos, Timur left. The Turco-Mongol warlord did for Constantinople what the Latins could not, and the Romans thanked God and his mother for yet another miraculous delivery. The news spread to the west, and Manuel was overjoyed. Slowly, he began returning to his empire. Free of that existential threat, Manuel II Palaiologos could finally use his talents to give the Roman state a brief revival before its eventual death. Today, I will narrate to you the end of the Roman Empire, plain and simple. The last 50 years of Roman imperial tradition was quite the epic tragedy. Just when the Palaiologan dynasty produced 3 tireless, patriotic rulers willing to go to any lengths for their state, the situation at hand was irreversibly out of control. Manuel II Palaiologos, his son Ioannis VIII and Constantinos XI, by the grace of God, emperors of the Romans, really tried their best. But the best of 2 generations was not sufficient to undo the damage of their many incompetent and selfish predecessors. However, their efforts made sure that the Eastern Roman Empire would fall with a bang, and not perish with a whimper like the Western Empire. You're all familiar with Constantinople's last stand in 1453, but what about the lead-up to it? Let's explore. Timur, the terrible scourge of Eurasia, accidentally saved the Roman Empire from the Ottomans and did them a huge favor by breaking up the empire of Sultan Bayezid, the arrogant foe of Romania who now languished in a Timurid cage and killed himself out of shame. His sons and many other Turkish beys now contested for Anatolian hegemony, giving the Romans time to breathe. Emperor Manuel II was in Paris when he received news of Constantinople's deliverance, and after a long trip, he was back in 1403. His nephew and co-emperor, Ioannis VII, held the capital under intense stress while he was in Europe, so the younger Vasilevs expected some kind of reward. He had one in mind: Thessaloniki. Wait, you say. Didn't Thessaloniki already fall to the Turks in Manuel's youth? Yes, but remember, Ottoman Civil War. Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Musa, Isa, and Mehmed were too busy fighting each other, and Suleiman, who was based in Europe, sought the Romans as his allies. In the generous Treaty of Gallipoli, he returned Thessaloniki, Halkidiki, the northern Sprites Islands, and the coasts of Thessaly, the Marmara, and the Black Sea to the Romans, who were no longer vassals either. Ioannis VII signed this before Manuel returned, and this may have annoyed the older Vasilevs, who exiled his nephew for some reason. Ioannis VII was obviously upset and joined up with the Gattilusio of Lesbos to wrest Thessaloniki from Manuel, who saw sense and just gave him Thessaloniki in peace. Manuel's trusted officer, Demetrios Laskaris Leontaris, escorted him to Thessaloniki, where he ruled, quite adeptly if not too autonomously, until his death. Andronikos V, his son, was to be both Ioannis VII and Manuel's heir, but the boy died young, and the line of Andronikos IV finally left Roman politics. Good. Let's leave Ioannis VII to serve Thessaloniki while we return to Manuel. Manuel may not have liked the treaty with Suleiman, but he ratified it. Now the empire was back on its feet, and it was the Turk who submitted to the Roman, not vice versa like years ago. Manuel could finally put his talents to use. The next decade, he expertly played the Ottoman princes against each other, while bringing his empire some recovery. Like Murad and Bayezid before, Manuel was now the kingmaker, the father that Suleiman, the European sultan, tried to please. In Asia, Mehmed took control. Musa was his underling, and Isa was killed. The Roman Empire sat smack in the middle of the Ottoman one, preventing its reunification, and Manuel intended to keep it thus. From 1403 to 1407, he continued actively pursuing his quest to gain Latin aid, though no Western power could spare itself. The Latins closer to home caused him no less headache either, as he had to help his dear brother, Despot Theodoros I of Morea, evict the Knights Hospitallers from Greece. Last episode, if you remember, even the highly capable Theodoros buckled under intense Turkish pressure in the Peloponnese, selling Corinth and Mistra to the Knights of Rhodes to defend. But the local Romans hated their new occupiers. Their despot had to get rid of them. With Manuel's diplomatic expertise, the Knights signed a treaty in 1404 and left the Morea. Soon, his fourth son, Constantinos XI, was born. In the West, Manuel chose a better ambassador, Manuel Chrysoloras, the most respected Roman scholar for the Catholics. In 1407, Chrysoloras left home to represent his Vasilevs in Europe. This, and Theodoros passing the same year, left Manuel in deep grief and solitude. The Vasilevs personally visited the Morea in 1408 to pay respects to his dead brother and install his son, Despot Theodoros II, in Morea. In Mistra, Manuel got the idea to write his famous funeral oration for his brother and to repair the Hexamelion, ancient fortifications in Corinth protecting the Peloponnese from northern invasions, but the project was postponed for later. Manuel first hurried north to Thessaloniki, where Ioannis VII died with no heir. So he made his young son, Andronikos, its despot, with Leontaris as regent. In 1409, Manuel returned home just in time to deal with Ottoman interregnum drama. Bayezid's most fierce son, Musa, just came to Europe to fight Suleiman, who quickly formally allied with Manuel in Constantinople the next year, but he proved too weak and was killed by 1411. Vengeful Sultan Musa now punished the Romans by besieging Constantinople. The now more experienced Manuel handled Musa's siege better than Bayezid's. It seems now the Romans had a small navy again, led by Admiral Manuel, a bastard brother of Emperor Manuel, who crushed the Turks at sea. The Vasilevs got diplomatic and allied with Mehmed in 1412. Though the Anatolian Sultan was at first defeated, Manuel kept encouraging him until he prevailed over Musa and reunited the Ottoman Empire in 1413. He would never forget Manuel's support. Mehmed returned to Manuel all the lands lost to Musa, and both gentlemen settled for peace. The Roman and Ottoman empires were chill neighbors for an only time in history, and Manuel could focus on his literary activities. He was an emperor who left us with a ton of written works. Most were authored in this age, and many were for educating his eldest son, Ioannis VIII, the ruler in training left to govern the capital when Manuel picked up his Hexamelion project in 1414. He first stopped by Thassos to personally lead a victory against the Getalusio invader of the island. Then he helped Andronikos in Thessaloniki before going to the Morea. In the west, Chrysoloras was at the Council of Constance before he died, working on church union. In 1415, Manuel's grand accomplishment of restoring the Hexamelion was done in just 25 days, at the cost of heavily taxing the Moreans, who revolted. The elderly Manuel again took the field and defeated the rebels. He used a lot of time pacifying the fiery Archontes in Morea before going home. While Manuel labored on the Hexamelion, Georgios Gemistos Platon, a philosopher he sent to the Morea, wrote to him. Platon thanked the Vasilevs for his efforts and shared his own 2 cents on how to make the Morea even better. Model it on Plato's ideal republic. He also proposed later, to the horror of Roman Orthodox contemporaries, a new religion, a synthesis of Platonism, Greek paganism, and Zoroastrianism, Now, before you call Platon a raving pagan larper who just got these ideas because the ruins of ancient Sparta were in his backyard, let me remind you that he was the most respected Byzantine intellectual in the empire and in Italy during his life. He was a top-rate teacher of Plato in Constantinople before his less orthodox ideas landed him in Mistra, where his renown continued to grow. Manuel and his sons adored him, even if they didn't take his advices. Classics lovers, Romans and Italians alike, flocked to meet him. His students certainly included the illustrious Bessarion of Trebizond and Isidoros of Kiev, if not Georgios Scholarios and Marcus Andronikos II. You'll hear their names a lot. Platon's most prominent pupils only followed their master in his infectious love of ancient Greek philosophy and culture, not religion as well. Like Byzantine Hellenists of old, their study of their Greek past only complemented their staunch Roman and Christian identities, not opposed them like Platon. Platon was the exception and not the norm. But he was the culmination of what many Palaiologan, Komnenian, and late Macedonian scholars have explored before him. Fascination for the Eastern Roman Hellenic heritage only grew as their empire declined, and with a personality like Platon, the Despotate of the Morea became the most fertile breeding ground for Byzantine Hellenism. This spirit, coupled with the indomitable nature of the Moreans, as seen with their repeated troublemaking for the Palaiologi, are partially reasons why the 1821 Greek Revolution began here. Might as well tease the rise of modern Greece, since we're talking about the fall of New Rome now. But I digress. In 1416, Manuel once more took advantage of Ottoman civil strife. Mehmed was having troubles with the pretender sultan, and Junayd, the last bey of Aydin. The Romans and Venetians backed them, leading to the destruction of Mehmed's fleet by the Venetians, again hindering the Turks from developing their naval warfare. As you'll see at the 1453 Siege of Constantinople, Christian superiority at sea was a large reason the city held out for so long. Mehmed defeated his rivals, but Manuel harbored them in his empire in exchange for the Sultan paying their pensions. This was smart. A few competitors in Roman territory could act as bargaining chips with the Turks, and being the master diplomat, Manuel did all this while causing no extreme hard feelings between him and Mehmed. Manuel's sons continued this policy, with less success. Speaking of Manuel's sons, it's time to introduce them properly, as Manuel was stepping out of government. When he went back to Constantinople, he let his eldest son, Ioannis VIII, try his hand governing the Morea. Ioannis was always supposed to succeed him, and Manuel took great care of his education. The young Vasilevs took after his father's patriotism, but sadly not his wisdom, believing in genuine union with the Latins and no compromise with the Turks. His youthful rashness would unravel the precarious peace Manuel achieved with his own subjects and the Ottomans. Ioannis briefly ruled in the Morea as training with his brother, Despot Theodoros II. Theodoros was the second son. He inherited his father's love of learning. An enthusiastic scholar, the despot fostered a lively intellectual scene in the Morea with Platon as its star. The bros teamed up for an expansionist Peloponnesian policy. Almost the whole peninsula would return to Roman control. From 1417 onwards, Venice complained often about the despot's aggression to Manuel, even long after Ioannis left the Morea in 1418. Meanwhile, a new pope showed support for the Morea by granting indulgence to all Latins who helped with the Hexamelion, and he got Catholic brides for Ioannis and Theodoros. Manuel's third son, Andronikos, despot of Thessaloniki, was a nice lad, but his ill health prevented him from being as able as his brothers. The most capable was, of course, the fourth son, Konstantinos Dragatsis, who was still young, but already got himself a devoted historian to document his reign. A teenage official that Manuel just recruited, called Georgios Francis. Francis grew very close with Konstantinos and faithfully served his master all while writing a valuable chronicle. The two youngest sons, Demetrios and Thomas, would be the last despots of the Morea and the last rulers of the Palaiologan Empire, but they were selfish and incompetent. Thomas slightly less so. Now the Latin brides, Sophia of Montferrat and Cleova Malatesta, arrived in 1420. Ioannis married Sophia in 1421, and he was formally crowned. Ironically, Ioannis would detest his wife, who was not so pretty. Yet Theodoros hit the jackpot, marrying the gorgeous and intelligent Cleova. who thoroughly Romanized and formed a power couple with him. Now that Ioannis was in charge, he and his faction wanted to take the fight to the Ottomans. Mehmed was coming to Thrace. Ioannis' friends wanted to kill him, but Manuel refused, although the gentleman sultan died shortly anyway, succeeded by his son, Murad II, who would have liked to just keep being pals with Manuel, but Ioannis decided to let the pretender Mustafa, who lived in the empire, go stir up a civil war among the Turks. At this point, Manuel was too old and tired, so he just let his son fully take over. Big mistake. Mustafa was crushed the next year, and Murad, learning of the Roman betrayal, ended their friendship. With full Ottoman might, he came for Constantinople. The 1422 siege of Constantinople saw the Romans more willing to defend their capital than 20 years ago. Men, women, elders, everyone contributed. Ioannis personally led assaults against the Ottomans, who got their first small cannons and bombarded the walls while the Roman defenders had a few handguns. The age of gunpowder empires was coming, and though the Romans fought off this siege, whether due to Ioannis' leadership, intervention from the Theotokos, or just clever old Manuel inciting Murad's baby brother who took Mustafa's partisans to rebellion, Romania wouldn't be so lucky next time. Thessaloniki was also besieged. Everything Manuel worked on the past 2 decades was gone, and tellingly, he had a stroke just after the siege, when some papal legates came to discuss church union, which Ioannis was wholeheartedly for. In fact, Ioannis now traveled to the west in 1423 to ask for help like his father, while his brother, Andronikos, was collapsing from Turkish pressure on Thessaloniki. No longer able to defend it, the sickly despot offered Venice the second city of the empire if they could respect the rights and faith of the Romans there. Venice accepted, bringing some relief to the Thessalonians at first, but they wouldn't fare much better against the Ottomans. This is the definitive end of Roman Thessaloniki. 30 years later, it would be Roman Constantinople's turn. Ioannis' other brother, Theodoros, also had to deal with Turkish onslaught, as Turhan Bey breached the Hexamelion and devastated the Morea. Things looked dire. In 1424, Ioannis returned with no help gained. Again, it was Manuel who cleaned up the mess by signing a treaty with Murad, ceding all territories from Suleiman, and the emperor had to pay the sultan for the right to rule. Venice tried to get along with Murad, but failed, and Thessaloniki was still threatened. The only part eligible for a Roman revival was the Morea. As soon as the Turks left, Theodoros turned to face the Latins there. Achaia was dwindling. The Duke of Athens was a Turkish vassal, but Carlo Tocco, Lord of Kefalonia and Epirus, had designs in the Peloponnese. In time, the Palaiologos brothers would drive them all from their despotate. Sadly, Manuel died in 1425. His death was mourned by all his subjects. At age 75, Manuel had seen it all. The deterioration from the days after his father and grandfather's civil war until his own times. It was a painful process to personally live through the slow death of his own empire, while dealing with insufferable nuisances like his idiot family and neurotic nemesis Bayezid. But he gained so much experience that he became a living bundle of political wisdom. He matured so much through his trials and errors, and the last brief window of tranquility in Roman history was all his work. He learned to masterfully utilize Roman soft power and diplomacy to get what's best for the empire, from dangling the possibility of union with the Latins to maintaining amity with the Ottomans. There is some tragedy in his story, like that of Heraclius, just having put the empire on the path to recovery and losing all his gains to one mistake. Perhaps Manuel could have passed on more of his prudence to Ioannis, but his impact on the empire and beyond was by no means small. His tour of Europe was so sensational, the Latins began appreciating and sympathizing with the empire which once ruled their lands, instead of just dismissing the Eastern Romans as schismatic Greeks. Manuel and his ambassador, Chrysoloras, generally did so much to kickstart the Renaissance thanks to their erudition. In the Roman Empire itself, the subjects who followed Manuel on this tumultuous journey grew with him. They passively resisted his attempts to save Thessaloniki and Constantinople from Ottoman sieges in the 14th century, preferring safe vassaldom to taking a risky stand for their honor. Now in the 15th century, they proved more than eager to fight for the empire in the 1422 siege, and soon in the 1453 one too. Maybe, seeing the Vasilevs giving his all to the welfare of the state changed the Roman mentality, which got so used to the abuses of the bickering and privileged Palaiologi for too long. We could thank Timur for his accidental salvation of the empire, but we should also acknowledge Manuel's efforts in making the best of them. He, more than anyone else, was why the Roman Empire survived 5 decades more in Constantinople and 6 in the Morea. Legendary. Sorry for the Manuel eulogy. Back to history. The next few years, Ioannis VIII, now sole emperor, spent his attention on continuing his aggressive policies in the Morea. In 1426, he went there with his favorite brother Konstantinos to help Theodoros fight Karotoko. They arrived in 1427 and conquered Clarenza from him, then the last ever Roman naval victory at the Battle of Pachymeres, led by Leontarius, that ended all Toko's Peloponnesian ambitions. The next year, Konstantinos married Toko's daughter and gained his lands as dowry. Then he assaulted Patras with his brothers. But he wasn't content with just that. In 1429, he conquered Patras, getting him on the watch list of both the Latins and Turks. His historians Francis pacified the Turks, but the Latins fought on for another year. Meanwhile, Thomas was subjugating the decaying principality of Achaea. Like his brother, he gained lands by marrying the last prince's daughter. Things looked good in southern Greece, and when Thomas and Constantinos switched capitals in 1430, so that Constantinos moved north and got Corinth, he could now pursue his projects in central Greece. But in the north, in Thessaloniki, the Venetians kind of forgot their promise to respect Roman rights, and with an unwilling garrison, Murad's assault on 29 March saw the metropolis fall definitively to the Turks. It was a bloodbath. All Romans mourned. Then Murad took Ioannina from Karotoko, despot of Epirus. These devastating losses pushed Ioannis to seek union with the Pope, who died in 1431 and complicated the negotiations. The Romans were supposed to attend a council in Basel, Switzerland, but a successor, Eugenius IV, wanted it to occur in Italy. It was a pissing contest between Basel and the papacy over who could make the Eastern Romans Catholic, and both sides tempted Ioannis, who would eventually accept the Pope's offer. His efforts for church union took up most of his reign. He ignored his father's advice to never commit to union, as the Roman people never accepted, and the division is more harmful than any foreign threat, seen in the reign of the first Palaiologan emperor. But Ioannis really believed in Christian unity, and spent the 1430s assembling the most impressive delegation of Roman sages for Italy. Meanwhile, the Turks invaded the Morea again, with no lasting damage. Ioannis' brothers, the despots, did good for the state closer to home. When the Prince of Achaea died in 1432, Thomas swooped in to inherit his remaining lands, thus ending the principality. Now, except for several Venetian port cities, all of the Morea was Roman again. The despotate prospered, but in 1433, its despina, Cleopha, died. Scholars of Mistra mourned for their patroness, but none was more affected than her husband, Theodoros, whose mental state and bond with his brothers deteriorated, especially with Konstantinos, who was getting into the succession crisis of the Achéoli Dukes of Athens from 1434 to 1435. He failed to get Athens, and the old Athenian noble family, the Halkokontili, who would produce the historian Laourdas, emigrated to Mistra for supporting the wrong side. Then Konstantinos was called to Constantinople by Ioannis, who was preparing to leave for Italy and needed a trusted brother to guard the capital for him. But Theodoros was hurt when he found out in 1436. He thought he should be the heir of this childless Ioannis, since he was older, and when Konstantinos returned to settle things in the Morea, the brothers skirmished. They fell to the chronic Palaiologan illness of incessant infighting. But thankfully, this was resolved by Ioannis. Theodoros would rule Konstantinos' part of the Morea, while the latter left as regent of Constantinople in 1437. Konstantinos had his mother, the respected Dowager Empress Helena, his loyal friend, Sphrantzes, and his Macedon, Lucas Notaras, to guide his governance. Constantinople was in capable hands, and so was the faith of the Romans. Ioannis left for Italy with a great train of thinkers to debate with the papacy on the differences between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. He took care to include representatives from all parts of the Roman Orthodox sphere: Alexandria, Jerusalem, Wallachia, Georgia, and Russia, whose new metropolitan was Isidoros of Kiev, the Roman student of Plato, who also followed along to represent the philosophers of the Morea, despite not even being Christian. Georgios Galerius came on behalf of the philosophers of Constantinople, and the emperor, whose new empress, Maria Megarikomnini, was a Trapezuntine princess, didn't forget to get a delegation from his wife's native country, led by Georgios Amiroutsis. Bessarion of Trebizond and Marcos of Ionikos, recently ordained bishops, further complemented this learned retinue. The only person out of place here was Ioannis' brother, Demetrios, a staunch anti-unionist who wanted to claim the throne with Turkish help. No way Ioannis could leave him unsupervised. In Ferrara, the Pope hosted all 700 of Ioannis' men in 1438, but he was broke, so in 1439 he moved the council to Florence, city of the wealthy Medici. The Vasilevs' visit excited the Italian scholars and painters, but the council debates weren't fruitful. Still, union was celebrated on 6 July in Il Duomo. This would be an appropriate term for the next chapter in Roman history. If Ioannis expected to be welcomed as a hero for securing Catholic aid, he was to be disappointed. His beloved Maria Komneni, the last ever empress of the Romans, was dead, and people weren't sympathetic in the least. Violent insults were heaped upon Ioannis and those who signed the union daily. Bessarion was so sick of their bullying that he left permanently to become a cardinal in Old Rome. When Isidoros returned to Kiev in 1441 to bring news of the union, the Russians arrested him, and he escaped to Italy. Marcos of Ionikos didn't sign for the union, and now that he was home, he spoke his mind freely, becoming a champion of the Orthodox. Another champion was Demetrius, who used this as an excuse to plot with the Turks. Ioannis was so lost that he recalled Constantinos, who left for the Morea once his brother returned. On the way, he married a second time on Lesbos to Katerina Gatelousi, and once he saw that the Morea did well without him, he thought about letting Demetrius switch appanages with him. He could take over his old post in Salimbria, closer to Ioannis, and Demetrius could be far away. But in 1442, the Turks backed Demetrius in his attempt to take Constantinople. Constantinos saved the day, and Demetrius was imprisoned, and Salimbria was given to Constantinos in 1443. But he soon left, as Theodoros proposed to switch the Morea for Salimbria with him. And being sick of life around the capital, Constantinos agreed, becoming despot of the Morea. And he was the last great despot. First, he fixed the ruined Hexamelion, then in 1444, he began reconquering the Duchy of Athens, an Ottoman vassal. He chose a good time. The crusade the Pope promised Ioannis was ready under the famous Hungarian János Hunyadi. Constantinos could menace the Ottoman rear by taking the duchy. He conquered Thebes and Athens, and vassalized the Duke, who cried to his Turkish master. But Murad was busy destroying the Latins at Varna. Like the one in Nicopolis, this crusade saw most crusaders slaughtered. Only Hunyadi escaped. However, Murad took a break before he decided to handle Constantinos, who used 1445 to expand further north, through Phokis and taking everything up to the Pindos range, including Ottoman cities. And that was the final straw for Murad, who marched against the despot in 1446 with a massive army. All of Constantinos' latest conquests were lost, and he retreated into the Morea proper. He tried to take a stand with Thomas at his rebuilt Hexamelion, but Turkish cannons blasted through it, despite Constantinos' and Thomas' efforts. Foreshadowing for Constantinos' future combat with cannons during the siege of Constantinople? In any case, the despotate was devastated by Murad and Turahan Bey. The Ottomans left with 60,000 slaves and the Morea as a vassal. Constantinos spent 1447 repairing the damage, having learned not to travel with the Turks the hard way. Like Manuel and Ioannis, who now ruled an ever more hopeless empire, and no European could really help the Romans now. And in Constantinople there was almost a succession crisis. Theodoros died, followed by Emperor Ioannis, who died with no official heir. Everyone knew he favored Konstantinos, but the despot was far away in the Morea, while Demetrios, recently released, was close by. Thanks to Empress Dowager Helena, his Francis, and Laourdas, however, Konstantinos' succession was secured, and the last Roman emperor was crowned in the Morea in 1449, an unprecedented ceremony. This would have pleased Ioannis. He was an emperor who gave everything he got but simply couldn't amount to the challenges. Union made him hated, despite his sincerity. The empire he left his capable brother was unsalvageable. Emperor Konstantinos XI stepped into the divided capital, where the Romans still rejected everything Union-related, including the Patriarch of Constantinople. So it was good that he was crowned in Mistra. He then took care of his despotate, sending Demetrios to co-rule it with Thomas, and these two would see the Morea get no chill due to their constant bickering. Only with intervention from the emperor or the sultan could they stop their quarrels. Konstantinos ruled over a polarized people in an ancient city that had long since lost its grandeur, but for a time, it seemed as if this new Roman emperor would bring hope. But as the 1450s dawned, everything became more hopeless. His mother, the wise and respected Helena, died in 1450, depriving the empire of an experienced counselor. Francis left for the east to earn his widowed emperor a bride from Trebizond or Georgia, with no result, dooming the last Roman emperor to have no project. In 1451, the Patriarch had it with the toxicity in New Rome, and he left for Old Rome forever. He was to be the last Patriarch of Constantinople before the fall. Worst of all was Murad's death that year, leaving his son, 19-year-old Mehmed II, the Sultan. If Mehmed was just a normal kid, then this would have been good news, as the Emperor Ioannis IV of Trebizond told Francis, who knew the truth and didn't celebrate. Mehmed wasn't a normal kid. He didn't have a happy childhood, and his obsession with conquering Constantinople had already landed him in trouble with his own Ottoman officials. The only one with any influence over this headstrong sultan was his stepmother, Mara Brankovic, part of the late Murad's harem, who could leave now with her husband's death. Francis and Ioannis IV felt that she could be a suitable empress for Konstantinos, but she refused. Meanwhile, Konstantinos grossly underestimated Mehmed, who seemed so compliant. He asked the Turks to increase their pension of an Ottoman pretender to the throne, Orhan, who resided in the empire. Mehmed smiled. Now, he had an excuse to finally conquer his desired city. In 1452, he began preparing the final siege. He constructed the fort Rumeli Hisar on the Bosphorus, like his great-grandfather Bayezid's Anadolu Hisar, to blockade the city. Konstantinos realized he messed up, and immediately asked for aid from the west. He had pursued Union to a degree, but the Westerners were too busy with their own stuff to help. The Morea could offer nothing either. Turahan Bey again invaded. The Morean story will continue the next time. In Constantinople, Isidorus of Kiev brought a few Latin works from the Pope, but he came more to preach union, and he was intensely opposed by Scholarios anti-unionists. The price of papal aid was full submission. Konstantinos had to celebrate unionist mass in the Hagia Sophia with Isidorus. Now the anti-unionists wouldn't even step into the great church, while Mehmed was uniting the Ottoman army with purpose. He was able to pay the Hungarian gunmaker, Orban, to build the biggest, baddest cannon ever to bombard the impregnable Theodosian walls. The Romans mounted to defend their city with Venetian ships and the Genoese noble Giustiniani, a brave volunteer, since Genoa decided to stay out of it. A lot of the last defenders of the city were volunteers, and in total, the garrison numbered 7,000. In early 1453, Turks in Rumelia took the last of Roman Thrace. The city was isolated. On April 2nd, the siege began with heavy bombardments. This story is familiar to all of you. Mehmed fired relentlessly at Constantinople day and night, causing the mighty Theodosian walls to finally begin to crumble. Justinian and the Romans defended the walls as best as they could, while few reinforcements came from the west. The Turkish navy was outmaneuvered by 4 Christian ships supplying the city and greatly humiliated, to the joy of the defenders and the wrath of Mehmed, who decided to just get rid of his naval inferiority by rolling ships overland into the Golden Horn, behind Galata, and the Genoese there pretended to see nothing. The Romans found in horror the Turkish fleet in their harbor and planned to burn the ships, but this attempt failed due to bickering between the Venetian and Genoese allies. This was the turning point from which things went full downhill. Justinian still defended the city walls valiantly, and the Scottish mercenary John Grant countered Turkish miners who wanted to destroy the foundations of the walls, but not much could be done anymore. However, Constantinos refused to surrender when Mehmed offered it, stubbornly resisting until the very end, which was drawing near. No one would help them now. Venice and the Pope promised more large ships, but they weren't coming. The Romans could only place their hope in the aid of their protectress, the Virgin, but even she seemed to desert them, and the red glow above the dome of the Hagia Sophia was seen as her leaving her city in these strange lights. More despair reigned, but on the night of the 28th May, Romans and allies alike united in the Hagia Sophia for one last shared Mass. They forgot the controversy of union, and that the Italians were heretical according to them. Orthodox or Catholic, it stopped mattering. They just wanted one last liturgy in Justinian's great monument before the city was stormed, as Mehmed was preparing for the final grand offensive just outside, also stoking up the religious fervor of his men. The emperor addressed the defenders one last time in a memorable speech before taking a stand for his empire. The massive Turkish army threw all they got at the weakened walls, and while the Christians had beaten off 2 waves, the 3rd wave of elite janissaries was simply too much to handle. The Turks stormed in, and Vasileus Constantinos XI Dragasis Palaiologos, last emperor of the Romans, fell fighting for Constantinople with his men. His body was never found, leaving some to ponder if he had been carried off by angels at the last moment to fight another day. A night of chaos passed, and on 29th May 1453, Constantinople was in the hands of Mehmed II. Constantinople would serve him well as the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. And thus ended the Roman Empire. I'll leave the narrative here and clean up the pieces next time. How the Sultan treated his prized conquest, how he dealt with the Morea and other pockets of resistance in the Roman world, and what it all means. But this isn't the end of the Roman story. Even if the next video will be the last in the Eastern Rome Summarized series, I have long alluded that I will go back to 1280 and recount Trapezuntine history in Trebizond Summarized. The Roman Empire had fallen. The Roman Emperor fell while defending his capital. What remained of the Roman state and people after the Ottomans conquered Constantinople? What survived, and for how long? We'll find out in this video, where we tie up the Palaiologan story and Eastern Rome Summarized. So we'll explore what happened to the yet unconquered Romans in the Morea. In 1453, despots Demetrios and Thomas Palaiologos were busy dealing with the revolt. The Morea exchanged its exceptional despot, Constantinos, for these imbeciles. Well, Thomas was okay when he partnered with Constantinos. He was capable, but now, co-ruling with the faithless Demetrios, he became just as useless. If you remember from last episode, Turahan Beg invaded Morea for the gazillionth time, and he was only beaten back by Mattheos Asin, Demetrios' brother-in-law. Everyone could see how incompetent their despots were, and the Albanian immigrants especially despised the petty despots for their weakness. They hailed the Lord of Mani, Manuel Cantacuzínos, great-grandson of the famous first despot of Morea, Manuel Cantacuzínos, whose smooth reign made the sources so quiet, as their new despot. Meanwhile, the bastard son of the last prince of Achaea also led revolt. The former took over Demetrios' part of the despotate, while the latter caused havoc for Thomas. The despots couldn't even crush the revolts as a team, let alone in their state of non-cooperation. So they did the only thing they could: beg Mehmed to enforce order. The Sultan sent Turahan Bey in 1454 to help the despots police the realm, and the rebels were suppressed. If you're wondering why Mehmed didn't just conquer the last Roman polity, well, he knew the despots were absolute jokes and posed no threat. Better keep them around and pay tribute. Life went on in the Morea. Asen, the only capable military man in the despotate, became Lord of Corinth. Thomas the Latinophile and Demetrius the Turcophile kept hating each other, though they both hoped to restore the Roman Empire and be crowned the successor of their martyred brother. Thomas sent many embassies to the west, where there was some sympathy for Constantinople, and a crusade almost took place. In 1456, Thomas sent his envoy, the respected scholar Ioannis Argyropoulos, who stayed in Italy to teach Greek like many other Renaissance Roman exiles before dying from eating too much watermelons? Okay. Demetrius, usually very anti-Latin, also tried this and sent his own envoy, refusing to join Thomas' men. Meanwhile, Turahan Bey's son conquered all of the Duchy of Athens except for the Acropolis, which would fall 2 years later. This time, Mehmed personally came to receive the surrender of Athens in 1458, and he visited the city like a tourist before moving south towards the Morea. Apparently, the despots' incompetence stopped being so funny when they failed to collect enough tribute, and with their plotting with the West, Mehmed had enough. He led his army to besiege Corinth, whose ruler, Asen, was away, and the citizens put up a stiff resistance themselves. Mehmed left a siege force, while he ravaged other parts of the Morea, notably in the more Latinophile Thomas portion. Asen returned to Corinth and relieved his city, but even this capable general couldn't hold out once Mehmed returned. Corinth surrendered. The Sultan respected Asen, so he let him carry his terms to the despots, who agreed and ceded the northern Peloponnese to him. Thomas sulked. He almost lost all his lands, and now Demetrius was getting alliances with the Sultan. Unacceptable. The despots fought again, egged on by the lords in the Morea. In 1459, once Thomas got a few Latin troops from the Pope, he attacked Ottoman Morea with little success, and so he invaded Demetrius' lands, taking Manu. The Turks came for Thomas, but plague decimated them. So it was a golden opportunity to have peace again. The brothers then reconciled falsely as the Moreans had enough. But then Demetrius broke the peace over a few forts, and they fought again in 1460. Mehmed had enough and went to the Morea to meet Demetrius, who chickened out and sent Asen instead. That was the last straw from his hopeless vassals. Mehmed simply occupied Mistra on 29th May 1460, exactly 7 years after the fall of Constantinople. The despotate ended. The capital fell, and other cities followed. Demetrius was pissing himself with fear when Mehmed met him outside Mistra, only to find him smiling and offering him the appanage of Imbros and Limnos to compensate for the loss of his lands. Elsewhere, some Morean cities resisted, but most capitulated once they saw inhumane massacres by Zaganos Pasha, which disgusted even Mehmed. Monemvasia submitted to papal protection on Thomas' advice, and later Venice would take over. The last cities free of Ottoman control are all Venetian possessions, and Roman refugees fled there en masse, including Thomas and his family, who soon fled to the west. The Pope very happily received them and offered them pensions. In the Morea, one last fort stood defiant to the Turks: Salmenikon, the castle of the aptly named Konstantinos Graitzas Palaiologos. Mehmed and his janissaries had to personally lead the siege before Graitzas surrendered in July 1461, 8 years after his namesake had perished fighting for Constantinople. and I'll wrap this episode up by discussing the fate of the last despots of the Morea. Demetrios chilled in his appanage with his wife and brother-in-law Asen until 1467, when supposedly Asen cheated the Turks over salt trade profits on their islands and Mehmet banished Demetrius. He died as a monk in 1470 and his line ended. Thomas and his family were well received in Rome, but they were nothing more than fancy beggars living off papal money. He died in 1465. His claims to the Morea, and later even Constantinople, were inherited by his eldest son, Andreas, who tried to restore the empire but ended up spending all his money and had to sell his title to Spain. He still died in poverty in 1502. His younger brother Manuel fled back to serve the Ottomans and converted to Islam. Thomas' daughters fared better than his sons. Helena married a prince of Serbia, while Zoe married Ivan III of Russia, and their marriage gave Russia, the only independent and mighty Orthodox state left, pretensions of seeing themselves as a third Rome. But that is the fate of the Palaiologos dynasty, the last imperial Roman dynasty. Obviously, the family of the Palaiologi lived on for quite a bit after the end of the Roman Empire. We know of just high-profile exiles in the West until the 16th and 17th centuries, not to mention less-known ones who probably just quietly lived on in former Roman lands or somewhere in Italy and still exist to this day. Hell, some Palaiologos even ended up in the New World, in Barbados, living up to the Roman spirit of always exploring. But we won't trace every one of their stories. Now, it justifies us that we've covered the whole of 2 centuries that they reigned supreme over the Roman Empire, and even that took me so much research and time to bring you in this convenient one-video format. I won't give any judgments of the Palaiologi here as we wrap up this video, because, now that I look back, I realize I had been really opinionated. More opinionated than usual when narrating Palaiologan history. So, you know all my relevant views already. I guess that's just the effect of the dynasty that presided over the fall of the empire has. Everything they did will now get more analysis and critique. So that's it, the Palaiologan story. Hope you liked binging through it. Now, some of you might ask, why I didn't make a similar compilation for the Comini much earlier, since you know well that I favor the Comini much more. Well, the reason is simple. I'm not done with the Comnenian story just yet. Yes, I covered everything from 1081 to 1185, but I am a strong advocate for Comnenian continuity in the empire of Trebizond, which ruled for a further 250 years as a Roman state in Pontus. And I'm only working through Trebizondan history right now. Once that series is done, you will get another video like this. Be patient. I hope then you are ready for the next episode of Trebizond Summarized. This series is taking me a bit longer to make than usual due to circumstances in life, but I assure you all the wait is worth it. Next time we'll cover the Golden Age of Trebizond, an underrated period that, again, Roman historians barely ever talk about. Seriously, guys, late Byzantium needs more attention. Why are you all sleeping on it? I sometimes feel like I'm the only person outside of 100-euro paywall journals that really go in depth into this era for a wider audience. Anyway, no more rambling. I hope you all have a good day and you're excited for the next installment. Now I thank my patrons. Dragon Lord, Rompea Game Projects, Cody Dan Roth, Tiropita Productions, Francis Morin, Archduke Romalinios Lands, Patrick Gappo, and Kia Sick. Thanks everyone.